If you want a vision of the future, Winston, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever.
You want answers?
I think I'm entitled.
You want answers?
I want the truth!
You can't handle the truth.
Someone is trying to teach me a lesson in futility. Why am I the only one who isn't killed?
They will run you dizzy. They will pile falsehood on top of falsehood until you can't tell a lie from the truth, and you won't even want to. That's how the powerful keep their power. Don't you read the papers?
I just want to say one word to you. Just one word.
Yes, sir.
Are you listening?
Yes, I am.
Plastics.
I'm going to get your money for you. But if you don't get the President of the United States on that phone, you know what's going to happen to you?
What?
You're going to have to answer to the Coca-Cola Company.
The world is a college of corporations, inexorably determined by the immutable bylaws of business. The world is a business, Mr. Beale. It has been since man crawled out of the slime.
Welcome to another episode of Our Interesting Times. It's my pleasure to have Greg McCarron on the show. Greg is the co-host of the Antedote podcast. He does that show with Jeremy Rothe Kushel. Is that a weekly spot you do?
We try to do it weekly, at the very least bi-weekly, on a weekly basis. We've been had some relocation issues. We've been busy a lot, so we haven't been doing it every week, but technically we host every week. We post it on No Lies Radio.
Oh, so you have a life outside your podcast then?
What? Yeah, yeah, I guess you could say that, especially Jeremy.
Yeah, okay. Oh, especially, okay. Well,
yeah, we have a life outside of our podcast, so yeah.
Well, Greg, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
And, well, you're certainly welcome. And, well, tonight, first talk about your show, Antedote. I want to give the audience maybe an idea of what you do with that show and maybe pick up from there what you want to talk about tonight. You said you talk about controlled opposition, the sort of this false left-right paradigm, social engineering, so the psychological warfare. You also use a term I noticed in your podcast was psychographic. Maybe you can distinguish that from psychological warfare, too. Psychographic, right, was the word you used?
I may have been Jeremy who used that.
Okay. I thought that was interesting.
Think about that. I don't. It's a good question.
Okay, so what is psychograph? Anyway, so your show,
our program.
Okay, Antedote, the Antedote show. What's your intent? What do you do with that show? What's behind that show? What's the purpose?
Yeah, about a year ago, it was just I thought of this idea, and Jeremy and I, we talked about it, and we launched the Antedote, and we spell it actually Antedote, and there's a couple reasons for that. One is that Antidote, there's probably other programs or similar, radio that has that name, and also with Antedote, we named it Anti-A-N-T-E because meaning of ante is to raise the stakes of something. Like, for example, in a game of cards, you up the ante. So our goal with this program is to raise the stakes as far as conversation within the alternative media.
Oh, so it wasn't because of your public school education. No.
No, it wasn't.
Okay.
No. Anyway. I'm glad, thankfully I've moved away from all that. So that was just to raise the stakes of alternative media discourse and to critique the alternative media even more so than the mainstream media. Because I think Jeremy and I, we share this belief that in a lot of ways, it's more important to understand the, quote, alternative media than it is to understand even how the mainstream media works.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah, that's true. Because the alternative media, if anyone is familiar with how the mainstream media has been co-opted and controlled for several decades, I think the whole mass media was created for the purpose of mass manipulation. So from the get-go, all the the big names, Walter Cronkite, Tom Brokaw, Peter Jennings, all these big names, CBS, ABC, NBC, CNN, they were these corporations have been created for the purposes of mass manipulation through mass communication. But it'd be naive to think that as the alternative media came online with the development of the internet and these things, that in itself wouldn't be immune or from that type of manipulation or control. So
absolutely, and I think that in some ways you could even argue that the control of the alternative media is even more pervasive, alternative media in a lot of ways is even more controlled than much of the mainstream media is, and I feel like it's because when you have programs and outlets that are designed for elements of the population that are awake or that are at least partially awake, that have an understanding of a lot of the criminality that goes on. A lot of cases, the propaganda coming from many of these alternative media outlets, I'll use one example, would be InfoWars with Alex Jones, or on the left you have Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman. Those are just two examples. A lot of times with these alternative media programs, the propaganda has to be even more sophisticated than what you get in the mainstream media.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's what makes it so difficult, because you're dealing with limited hangouts or half-truths, and those are the most effective lies.
Exactly. What was it? I forget who made the quote, but if you have 95% of the truth and you mix in the 5% of lies, the 5% of the lies are much more influential than the 95% truth could ever be.
Yeah, I don't know if those ratios hold for these couple of examples, but if the Pentagon Papers or Watergate or Iran-Contra, right?
Yeah.
You might be dealing 50-50 or 40-60 or 30-70 in those ratios, but nevertheless, we get some, Doug Valentine says this, every now and then the deep state or the cryptocracy, these agencies show a little leg to get the public excited. And that's enough. You feed give the public a little bit of information. Of course, the example, the 1970s, the church hearings, the Rockefeller Commission, if you can believe that, looking into the abuses of the intelligence agencies. Yeah.
After all the criminality had been committed, they come out and reveal it afterwards.
Yeah, and no one's ever indicted. I think the closest was Richard Helms, and I think the former CIA director, for lying to Congress. But I don't think he never served any time, and so and I think Edward Bennett Williams was his lawyer, the late owner of the Baltimore Orioles, his billionaire oligarch lawyer, and so he was well rewarded for his efforts. So tonight, you wanted to talk about. Well, I'll let you go. What did you want to talk about tonight?
Well, with our program, Jeremy and I, we focused a lot on as I said, we focused a lot on the so-called, quote, alternative media and a lot of the players involved with that, and also within activist circles. And we've made we've devoted a large portion of our program to a lot of what's going on within the right wing in America, and in the West in general over the past several years, but of course, especially since the rise of Donald Trump, and our theory that we've outlined through various programs of ours, that this movement that is rallied behind Donald Trump, which is led by media sources such as Breitbart and a few others, InfoWars increasingly, that this is pretty much a network that has been created that is the creation of right-wing Zionism, and literally in a lot of ways a creation of State of Israel, and it is designed, I think, to bring in the right wing, the conservative Americans that are very uncomfortable with the way their country's headed and the way things are going. And the same goes in Europe as well, what you see with a lot of the European populist right wing movements. And it's a way to corral them into the same established means of same business as usual, but just under a very umbrella and the facade of populism and grassroots activism, and the facade of a grassroots movement. And so we've focused a lot on that, and a lot of the players involved in this alternative, in this right-wing movement which has taken place, it's really goes all the way back to the 50s and 60s, but it has, I think, reestablished itself in a major way with the rise of Donald Trump. And I'll give your viewers, I will mention a name of someone who's done a lot of work exposing this, and that's Nick Spiro. He hosts a program called Circus Maximus, and if you go to YouTube, you could type in Circus Maximus. You can find a lot of his programs. He had a program on the Renegade Broadcasting Network for a couple of years, and he's you can go through their archives and find some of the programs that he did where he's tied the pieces together as far as the controlled right goes, going all the way back to the John Birch Society, and even before that to people like Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn, of course, was McCarthy's lawyer and was the mentor of Donald Trump. Nick Spiro's done a ton of work in connecting these dots, and I give him a lot of credit with helping me to understand all of this. And so I thought I'd give him a shout out while we're at it. But that's what we focus a lot on, is the controlled right, and just how all of what we're seeing with the Trump movement and going back to the Tea Party and going back before that is a creation of the same system that it claims to oppose.
Mm-hmm. Have you given any thought, or I'm going to put you on the spot here, but Andrew Breitbart's untimely death and sort of this, well, he died of a heart attack on a street corner in the middle of the night, apparently, and then the coroner died of poisoning or something.
That's awfully strange.
Yes.
I don't know what to make of that, because with Breitbart, it's one of those cases where you don't want to make a martyr out of the man, but at the same time, you have to question what happened to him. And apparently he was claiming he was going to be putting out some pretty big revelations, and he also had been mentioning things related to John Podesta and the Clintons, like 5 or 6 years before all that scandal broke out too. So you do have to, while I don't for one second believe that he was a force for good, and certainly what he created and what Breitbart has become, I don't believe he's a force for good, but I definitely believe that the circumstances surrounding his death should be questioned and definitely should be scrutinized.
Yeah, we have, of course, in 1975, 76, you can go on YouTube and see Frank Church, I think Senator Goldwater, handling a heart attack gun the CIA used to to assassinate people, make it feel like natural causes. So obviously you can easily fake a death and make it look like natural causes, especially. But perhaps perhaps his shelf life expired, for his handlers, and he got it maybe. Yeah, and if you look at the roots of Breitbart, he's dealing, potentially with some dangerous people. And of course, he's investigating. Maybe he himself didn't know how controlled he was. This is just speculation. They're the best assets, perhaps. So I just thought that was interesting. The way he died. Of course, the coroner died of some what poisoning was it? Some sort of poisoning, and then there wasn't never any investigation. It just seemed very strange to me. But that is interesting. But as far these sort of this controlled opposition, the JBS, Roy Cohn. Of course, Roy Cohn worked with McCarthy, and was also close with Bobby Kennedy back in the 50s. But Roy Cohn also was a master of human compromise.
Yes,
and that was how he controlled the political process. I remember there was an anecdote about Roy Cohn. He's representing someone who's charged with a crime, and the guy starts talking about the case, and his response was, "Don't bother me with the case. Tell me who the judge is." And so that's how you control it, and that's how you may manipulate the judicial process or the criminal justice system. It's also how you would manipulate. One of the ways you manipulate the political process. Another way is bribery. Another way is blackmail, or a mixture of both. And of course, intelligence agencies, particularly intelligence agencies like the Mossad, are particularly adept at such tactics. Anyway, so you're looking back at sort of the John Birch Society. What was related to now? What was their function back in the early '60s, in sort of maneuvering the political process in a certain direction?
Well, my understanding of the John Birch Society, and I'm not an expert on the John Birch Society, but I believe that indeed that Robert Welch and the founder of the JBS, who was to the Welch's candy fortune. I believe there was Rockefeller funding involved with the establishment of the John Birch Society. But even going on from there, I believe the function of the JBS was to kind of control the anti-communist sentiment that was building in the country in the 50s and 60s, and in a way also made those who were critical of, say, of far-left activism, of any type of socialist Marxist activity in the West look like just completely discredit the opposition. I think that might have been the primary function of the JBS. I mean, if you've ever heard the song by Bob Dylan, the John Birch's Paranoia Blues, I mean, that's a perfect example of how JBS operated. There was a communist literally under every bed, and I'm looking for him under my bed, and I can't find him. And that's how I think that a lot of the more sensationalistic elements of an organization like JBS, I think that's what it was designed to do. And also, Jeremy's tied together that just before the Kennedy assassination, within weeks and months leading up to the Kennedy assassination, JBS is putting out flyers in literature calling John F. Kennedy a communist agent and all this, and almost like it's contributing to the climate that could have led to assassination of the president, and in a lot of ways perhaps turning its base against Kennedy in a strong way prior. And I would have to go back and look at all of that, but I think that the primary function of an organization like JBS would be to control and manipulate the opposition that was going on at the time to the post-World War II agenda, as far as setting up all these global institutions, all these global organizations, and just discrediting it to the point to where it couldn't be taken seriously by the majority of the population.
And at the same time, at a higher level, the communist threat itself was probably controlled opposition. If you go back in the history,
absolutely, absolutely. You'll find a lot of these prominent communist characters are all tied in with major capitalist bankers and tied in with the intelligence agencies, OSS and others, and banking institutions. So it just goes all over the place, and it's very pervasive, and it's like it's one entity of controlled opposition reacting to another created controlled opposition.
Yeah, and the OSS, of course, is bringing in these Marxists, cultural Marxism, and these things being promoted, ostensibly because they're anti-Hitler, I guess. But then after the war, they go into Hollywood and the university system, which greatly expands in the 50s and 60s, and they more or less infest the universities at the very time the children of the baby boomers of the 60s are going into these universities, and there you have the broad cultural agenda that's being played out, which universities are a great weapon in the culture war, because they create these what Wilhelm Reich called mass situations. And if you want to change the culture or sort of promote the sexual revolution, you do it through, one way you do it entertainment, another way you do it through education. But the universities themselves, all these young people at the same time going to the colleges that are filled with these professors that'll teach them to hate their parents and despise their values. So, I mean, it's too much to be a coincidence, really.
Then on the flip side of that, you have the reactionaries who, while they're talking about all this and while they're talking about how lamenting the decline in moral values and the decline in society and all this and the societal norms, they're not letting you know that they're not letting their bases know that this is pretty much all a created, orchestrated, manufactured decline in society. Instead, it's just a natural cause of liberalism, and liberalism is a mental disorder and all this. So while you've got one side where you're seeing the roots of the fruits of the 60s and all that, it create a lot of what that culture created. You've got, on the other hand, you've got the loyal opposition, which is just actually perpetuating this divide by just going after the symptoms, not talking about the root cause, and just playing right into the hands of those they oppose by just creating all this anger and hostility towards the people who are the foot soldiers, while you're not actually looking at the man behind the curtain. You're just focused on.
I mean, you could say the establishment, but you would say the silent majority, as Nixon referred to them. There's defenders of what's called decent society. In many respects, they were correct. But at the same time, they're morally compromised because they're supporting the war in Vietnam, and they're supporting all the violence. And the youth are seeing this, and the, young people are very good at spotting, at identifying hypocrisy in the elders, and that creates a contempt. And again, the ethnographers, the anthropologists, the psychological warfare specialists are working for the intelligence agencies and the foundations, and corporate America itself would see that as a form of social alchemy playing out here. Obviously the reaction of the older generation, the generation that kind of marched off to World War II and didn't create any problems, are going to look at this generation that are now burning their draft cards and not going off to Vietnam. They're going to say, "Why aren't this is what decent people do? This is what good patriotic Americans do."
And now, in this generation, good patriotic Americans support the military, and they support Israel, and they support they support anything that's done in the name of the military, and more than anything else, they support waging wars against those evil Muslims. Like in the 60s, it was the evil communists. Now it's the evil Muslims we got to go to war against. And it's funny, while on one hand, Trump and his base, they speak of America first, and they speak of opposing all these foreign interventions, but at the same time, they are the number one fomenters in, like I say, for example, you look at Breitbart, it makes the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal and the Weekly Standard, Bill Kristol's publication, look very dovish when it comes to a lot of the issues related on the war on terror. They're the number one purveyors of continuing this perpetuation of this myth that there's this imminent threat of terrorism from within Islam and Muslims, and that as a result is the and when they do that, that's very similar to how the communist hysteria worked in the 60s. But when you get all these America Firsters, they're talking about, we're America first, we're not interventionists, but they are perpetuating this phony, fake war on terror more than anyone else by continuing to sound off this alarm and this phony threat of creeping Sharia law and creeping a takeover of your society by these Islamic radicals. So they, more than anyone else, are fanning the flames to perpetuate and continue these wars.
Well, any close examination will reveal that Islamic radicalism or Islamic terrorism, these groups are always revealed to be assets of Western intelligence, and that goes back decades, back even to British Empire, were fomenters of this stuff, and proxy warriors, gangs.
That's not to say that people in the West should not be concerned about mass immigration and a lot of what happens with, as far as the divisiveness that results as a result of having two peoples that really don't have much in common coming together and being forced together into It doesn't mean that Westerners shouldn't have concerns about that, but their concerns are being manipulated, whereas instead of actually looking at the reasons why this mass immigration is taking place, which is the destruction of these countries and then the refugee crisis, which goes hand in hand, instead of that, their anger is being directed in the direction of the people themselves who don't have any power over this, and they're just pawns in all of this. And it's a lot of way with like immigration from Mexico and from Latin America, where instead of looking at the people that are actually causing these policies, their anger is being directed at those who don't have any power that are being scapegoated. The alternative media has just done a masterful job, I hate to say it, in just creating a literal culture of absolute hysteria and paranoia when it comes to Islam, which just ironically, of course, is the people that are the primary targets of this I use that term in quotations, our government's wars of aggression. So
and these things, this sort of low grade warfare or fomenting civil war, this policy of destabilization of so-called third world countries or developing nations or resource-rich nations in support of exploitation, because this goes back to the early days of the CIA in Guatemala and Latin America overall, where U.S. policy has always been to sort of treat it like a well, to exploit it for its resources and keep it poor and destabilized. And of course, if you doubt that, just if you look at what's the true objective, what was the true objective of Fast and Furious? Importation of weapons into Mexico to destabilize, to create the conditions where you have immigration providing cheap labor. You have that area in Mexico where you have the factories with cheap labor. That wouldn't be possible without the destruction of Mexican agriculture. And that's a policy that goes way back, even to the enclosure movement in Great Britain, and the destruction of the monastic system. These things where you created paupery. And then that's when they provided the massive humanity to transport overseas to places like Australia. They have the same policy in Ireland with the British, with the immiseration of the Irish people and their exploitation. Then the British policy creates the potato famine and these things, which creates mass exportation of Irish into the United States, which creates fodder for the Union Army and fodder for the factories to industrialize the United States. This policy it's just a policy of human exploitation, human harvesting. It's an ideology that seems to perdure. I mean, an oligarch's view of humanity, and when you can create conditions that impoverish people, make them desperate, then you can exploit them. And most Americans, of course, obviously the media doesn't cover this because it's not immediately obvious. You have to kind of read up a little bit, examine it, and do a little thinking. But it's pretty obvious if you think about it. So.
Yes, indeed. And on the topic of Vietnam and the John Birch Society and the anti-establishment movement and the similarities between now and the 60s, I've noticed that I mentioned that John Birch Society operates a lot like, say, Breitbart does now, or InfoWars to an increasing extent, with Alex Jones becoming more of a mainstream figure. But I'm noticing a similarity, whereas you had in the early 60s, you had William F. Buckley, who, by the way, I think you did a really fantastic program on just a couple of weeks ago. William Buckley, in his pages of National Review, condemned the John Birch Society, and now you've got the establishment Republicans are condemning Donald Trump and condemning Steve Bannon and Breitbart, and I think there's a very similar dynamic going on with that. And you look at a lot of there are a lot of similarities if you really take a look at the battle between the establishment Republicans and the JBS movement of the early 60s and what's going on now with the establishment, Bill Kristol, David Frum type Republicans against this Breitbart wing. I think there are very many similarities all the way from the nature of the war that is going on now within the GOP to the social nature of the country at the time as well, where you had all this turmoil taking place in the 60s and you have all this turmoil taking place now domestically.
Yeah, and of course, if it's not something, maybe not of course, but it's the turmoil, the upheaval was something that wasn't exactly organic or something that was just natural. It appeared to be fomented or created by the ruling elite, by the oligarchs, and that would be Time Life, Henry Luce, promoting drug use in the 50s. You have the creation of feminism, which Gloria Steinem controlled opposition. At the same time, the Kinsey Report's being promoted by Time magazine, the Kinsey Study. This is creating the grounds for the sexual revolution. You have, of course, Playboy magazine. The late Hugh Hefner suddenly being catapulted to success, and because he happens to have the pictures of Marilyn Monroe, who roughly at the same time is catapulted to stardom, and all this cultural and social creation that's going on into the 60s. Of course, right after Kennedy's death, you have music goes through this drastic change. You go from Leslie Gore and the Everly Brothers to the Beatles to the Rolling Stones. Pretty soon you have the cacophonous rock music of the 60s providing the soundtrack for that tumultuous time. But the music is there to provide the soundtrack for the events, which you had a recent show, which I haven't had the benefit of listening to yet, talking about Vietnam, about Ken Burns' Vietnam.
Speaking of which, I've heard that the only part of the Vietnam documentary that Ken Burns is accurate as the music was indeed the music that was created at the time. So I've heard that's about the only accuracy.
I'm sure. What I guess it's Jefferson Airplane, Creedence Clearwater Revival, Jimi Hendrix. Yeah, it's usual music. But yeah, I mean, it's and if you look at, of course, we look at the Gulf of Tonkin, this staged event, and of course, at the same time, a couple years before that, you have although we weren't aware of it, we weren't aware of it until I guess the early 2000s, but this Operation Northwoods regarding Cuba and this idea of the Joint Chiefs of Staff proposing false flag terrorist attacks being conducted on American soil to blame Cuba, to justify an invasion. Of Castro's Cuba. And if you're talking about controlled opposition, I don't know if you're familiar with Servando Gonzalez. And his
might have heard an interview with him once.
His book on Castro as a CFR agent, which is real paradigm shifting.
Yeah.
Because if you think about it, was it Castro's soldiers in Africa protecting the oil fields of Gulf and BP and these Chevron? And what did that serve? He was a great boogeyman to have in the Caribbean.
It would be a created paradigm where you have Castro, who may very well have been a creation, and then you've got the paradigm of having Fulgencio Batista, who basically just allowed Cuba to be a haven for mobsters and casino, big money, organized crime interests, and that's quite a paradigm to create there too. And it's, I think, another example of this classic paradigm where you have the two sides competing with each other for influence, but at the end of the day, they all achieve the same interests. It sounds like. Yeah,
and organized crime itself. Talking about I guess Traficante, Meyer Lansky, and these folks. Murder Incorporated might have served a function for a while, but since the 60s, it looks like that organized crime has gone corporate, and that's so well represented in places like Las Vegas.
We just had this major shooting where people like Sheldon Adelson and Steve Wynn just happened to be the kingpins of Las Vegas, and they're very much mob figures, if you ask me. And Las Vegas, of course, found on organized crime. They're close friends of Donald Trump. And there was a report that went around. I don't know if you saw this. It was published on the website 4chan, where about 3 weeks before the Vegas shooting, there was a warning of something taking place in Vegas, and that Michael Chertoff was looking to profit once again off of increased
scanners,
surveillance techniques, much like he did after during the TSA fiasco, and that Sheldon Adelson was going to install them in his casinos. So that's just something that came out within a couple weeks prior to the shooting. It was just a random leak on 4chan. I don't know if it should be taken seriously, but it is something that came out. But when you consider what you're just talking about with Murder Inc. and the mob becoming corporate, that's exactly what we've seen. And it's led by people in Las Vegas, such as Sheldon Adelson and also Steve Wynn, who I now believe is in charge of finance for the Republican National Committee. So,
and another example of sort of the racket, the organized crime racket going legit and becoming mainstream would be this. We just accept it now, but the proliferation of state lotteries used to be called the numbers racket. And
that's a good point.
It's just a way of life. The same way that that pornography has become normalized. Used to be relegated to certain areas, whether it's smut magazines or certain areas of town where you go see the smut films. It's become all normalized. And this is another example of degradation where, the whole point of, I mentioned you off call, but the whole point of degradation is making it so gradual that no one notices it, yet they submit to it because they're not even aware of it anymore.
Going back when we were talking about you mentioned Operation Northwoods, you mentioned the Gulf of Tonkin, and when I think about it now, the people of that time were so whipped into a frenzy about communism that anything that could be told to be blamed on communists, people would accept and believe. Now we've got a climate where you've got, I don't know what percentage of the population I'd say it is. It's pretty much the entirety of what passes for the conservative Republican base in this country, I believe, where they're whipped into this frenzy about Islam and Muslims and even, North Korea as well. I mean, because they see North Korea as being just another device an enemy, because all enemies are like the same according to American think, group think we have here. All enemies are the same. But I'm just thinking under this president, Donald Trump, who has such a loyal base behind him, and what if, and I'm just asking the question, what if there were to be some type of false flag that it could be perpetrated and blamed on someone, whoever, to say Iran or say a radical or generic random Muslim group, and it's used to justify another intervention? I think the reaction of the people, especially the base that is behind Trump, that is the most susceptible to this propaganda about Islam, I think it would make the reaction to September 11th look like child's play. That's a fear that I have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because the masses are easily manipulating these things, especially if they gullibly, credulously watch the media and what they're told in these events. I think there's a good portion that are sort of now knee-jerk or just naturally skeptical, but not enough. That's always. Unfortunately, if you look through our history, that's usually the case. Whether it's the sinking of the Maine, remember the Maine, to hell with Spain, or Woodrow Wilson's intrigues after he campaigned to keep us out of war. A month after he's inaugurated, he gets us into the war.
I hate war, and I'll keep us out of war forever.
Yeah, FDR, mothers, your sons will not fight any for him.
Bush said he was against nation building.
I remember that in 2000, saying normal nation, all these things. Time and time again, we have politicians that are running on the peace. Lyndon Johnson, for all people, ran as a peace candidate.
Oh, God, yeah, they painted, yeah. You've used that quote that somebody said they were told that Johnson keep him out of the war, and then they got into the war when they voted for Johnson.
Yeah, they said if I voted for Goldwater, this is a joke in 1965, I guess. They said if I voted for Goldwater, they told me we'd be at war a year later. I did vote for Goldwater, and we were at war a year later.
Right.
So that's the and that's a great illustration just how, well, in the end of the day, just what a mockery the ballot box is. It's an insult to everyone's intelligence, because the oligarchs decide who gets nominated. Even then, they can set up a loser like Goldwater. To what extent Goldwater was legitimate, he wasn't going to win anyway. But yeah, they can set that. They can set. In '68, Nixon was a peace candidate. His secret plan to end the war. 5 years later, hey.
Nixon freaking end the war. Yep.
Yeah. I guess more bellicose president to win an election would be Reagan in '80. Who was campaigning on the idea that Carter was weak, and that's another example where the media gives us a limited hangout or half truth about the Iranian hostage crisis. Mm-hmm. And the intrigues, the October surprise thing, where that was sort of just tossed out as wild conspiracy theory. But if you look into it,
yeah.
First of all the shenanigans and crimes committed by the deep state intelligence agencies. In this case, we're talking about sort of a privatized, this is Safari Club group that didn't like Carter allegedly because Carter had done that massacre. And
wasn't this Team B that was set up by George Bush Sr.?
Yeah, Team B, and you have all these guys with their connections setting up, and they supposedly had to privatize intelligence because the post-Watergate scandals had supposedly paralyzed the intelligence agencies. Yeah, if you believe that, fine. But this group then engineered sort of this coup against Carter. One was setting up the conditions for the Iranian Revolution. The Shah had expired, his shelf life had expired, and they facilitated, Khomeini coming to power, talking about false opposition.
Yeah,
that's a whole other thing.
Actually, on that topic, I'm glad you mentioned the Iranian Revolution, because on that topic, I don't know if you've heard of him, Brendan O'Connell. He's an activist from Australia and New Zealand. He's put out a lot of convincing information, I think, that should be strongly considered, that a lot of the Iranian Revolution was itself just another controlled mechanism, and that a lot of the people that were connected, a lot of the leading players within Iran are products of Western intelligence and banking institutions, and so that he's put together a very interesting perspective on Iran that I think should be strongly considered. That not all Iran's another country where all may not be what it appears to be, as far as the legitimacy of a lot of elements of what took place in Iran and what continues to go on now.
Yeah, you have all the saber rattling with Iran back and forth. But at the end of the day, nothing ever happens. But then in the meantime, again, a lot of fear stoked up. That means more defense spending and these things. But initially, just going back to 78, 79 it's I think it's Henry Kissinger who talks Carter into accepting the Shah into the country, which
would set the Iranian people off in a big way.
And as a pretext for United States government freezing Iranian assets would happen to be in Chase Manhattan Bank.
Well, that's just a coincidence, I'm sure.
Cui bono, as they say. But so, and like you said, so that's a crazy conspiracy. That's not of all the things that pulled by the big banks and their intelligence agencies. That's probably the least sinister.
I think David Rockefeller actually talked in his memoirs about his relationship he had with the Shah as well.
Mm-hmm.
So,
excuse me. Of course, Rockefeller is the one that put Carter in office. He was a trilateralist.
Yeah, they were looking for a Southerner who could be presented to the population as a means to present the New South, and basically Jimmy Carter was chosen out of was chosen to be the face of the New South.
Then he set up with Billy and Burt Lance and that scandal that leads to BCCI and all that. And of course there was you talk about controlled opposition. Of course, one part about controlling opposition is manipulation of the media, and one example, of course, is Carter's face being plastered on Time, Newsweek, and U.S. News and World Report. And
very similar to what happened with Obama back in 2008 when his face was put everywhere, and that media campaign. So yeah,
and when you talk about when you're talking about Trump, you talked about his connections to big media and some of these.
Yes.
That was an interesting,
yeah,
analysis there.
With the media, the thing that I think we did a program that was focusing on the war between Trump and CNN. Like a big part of Trump's appeal is that he's been calling out CNN, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's basically a fake news institution. But when you look at the campaign, it's really interesting when you actually evaluate. I mean, Trump and Jeff Zucker, the head of CNN, they have a long relationship. It was Jeff Zucker and the New York Times Magazine, of all places. I always like to find good links within publications like that if you can read between the lines. And there was a really good cover article written for New York Times Magazine which details the relationship between Trump and Jeff Zucker. And even this article in New York Times Magazine, of all places, is basically saying that they helped each other. That Trump gave Jeff Zucker a hit TV program when he needed one, which was, of course...
Yes.
And then when CNN needs the ratings and the attention... Now, Donald Trump comes along, and it was CNN, if you can believe it, I think CNN, more than the other media outlets, was more responsible for giving Donald Trump this nonstop media platform than any of the other media outlets were. And so you really start to evaluate that. Was it an example of CNN? Well, you could say the easy CNN is just trying to destroy Trump, but is it also a way to CNN putting out this information in part? I'm not saying there's not genuine opposition to Donald Trump within the CNN media empire, because I'm sure there is at levels. I'm sure there is. They have their own infightings within the establishment. I'm sure there is. But is it possible that when you look at the relationship Trump and Jeff Zucker have had over the years and their warmness, and clearly they've had a close, warm relationship. They were in contact with each other during the campaign, and Trump and Zucker would message each other and talk on the phone about things and the way he was being covered and all that. And Trump would complain to Zucker if a CNN commentator said something specifically about him. But is it possible that perhaps CNN was giving Trump this coverage knowing that it would cause the population to react in a certain way? And you got to remember that Donald Trump is a master at understanding media and how to work the media, because he's been in New York City for all these years. And Donald Trump basically was created by the tabloid press in New York City. The image we have of Trump and his image and his persona was created by that in the public eye. It was Trump's been at war with the New York City tabloids for the past 40 plus years. And so he knows how to handle negative media coverage and use it to his advantage. And you have to wonder if this was a desired reaction in a lot of ways to portray Trump as this ultimate boogeyman of the liberal media. Was it a desired reaction, knowing that you've got a powerful enough media on the other side with the rise of the internet that could counter it?
And, of course, Trump's political ascendancy is a great illustration of the connection between the the political world with the business world with organized crime. If you look at Resorts International, which he bought, which traces back to Meyer Lansky.
Yes. Yeah, Michael Collins Piper documented all that.
Yeah. I mean, that's the Mary Carter Payne Company. There's also connection to intelligence. That was a front company established to launder the money. Of course, this builds. Like, I think isn't that what financed Paradise Island or something down there? And same with Las Vegas is financed by this stuff, and it becomes normalized, a big part of American culture and entertainment. The same thing with Los Angeles and Hollywood. The corruption of Los Angeles is feeds Hollywood, which then legitimizes Hollywood culture and then spreads Hollywood culture, LA culture, the rest of the country. These things. So it really is amazing. I mean, it can be overwhelming if you think about it, but it's kind of like in your face, but no one seems to even want to think about it. I mean, and Roy Cohn, Meyer Lansky, all these people.
I think with another interesting fact about Trump is that when he got into trouble with casinos and he went through various bankruptcies, it was Wilbur Ross, who now is the Commerce Secretary. At the time, he was the head of bankruptcies for Rothschild Inc., who essentially bailed Trump out. And I believe this is back in the early, through his various bankruptcies over the years, I believe Wilbur Ross was involved in bailing him out. So there's a Rothschild connection right there to Trump via the man who, working for Rothschild Inc., who's now the Commerce Secretary, helped bail him out of these bankruptcies and the problems that he ran through with those over the years. And there's another connection, but Jeremy and I, we've identified that there is people say Trump is an outsider, right? He's an outsider to the DC political consensus, and in a lot of ways, he truly is an outsider to the DC political consensus. But on the other hand, there's another element of this so-called deep state, whatever you want to call it, that Donald Trump is directly and very intimately connected to, and that is the you maybe call it the New York City elements, probably elements within the city of London that extend into, of course, Las Vegas and into Israel as well, that basically run the global organized crime mafia racket. And casinos, of course, are a major part of that. So Trump is very deeply, intimately connected to this other element of the establishment of this deep state, whatever you want to call it, that doesn't get the attention that the political elite get. No, and I think that's where it comes from. So Trump's basically just working for another team in this whole battle, it seems like. And he is, people say he's an outsider to D.C. They're right, but he's not an outsider to the establishment in no way, shape, or form.
Because Washington itself ultimately serves the banking interest of New York and London. These are the political managers that are hired by families like the Rothschilds, who have, at least since the 19th century, have I think suborned and controlled governments for the banking interests, through leveraging debt, and this is how usury, the legitimization, this normalization of usury into the banking system, and how people just don't question, but that's a method for intergenerational debt slavery and control, manipulation through the currency. But you talk about something, a family like the Rothschilds, and they're manipulating. I mean, people don't realize it. People think the moment you mention Rothschilds or Bilderberg, people think you're a conspiracy nut because we're told these families aren't important.
Right. Well, David Duke says they're irrelevant, so the Rothschilds are irrelevant according to him. So.
But I mean, look at throughout history. I mean, if you look at the things like Manifest Destiny, I think that was August Belmont. He was a Rothschild agent. Commodore Perry, he's the one that pried open Japan from in the 1850s. His daughter married into the Rothschild. I think his daughter married August Belmont, and he was so she was marrying into the Rothschild family. And some people even look at something like the events like the War of 1812 and the so-called American Civil War as sort of a crisis that was fomented by these very banking interests. That's going further back into history, and that's a little bit more mysterious. But if you look at this is done through B'nai B'rith and Freemasonry, and if you look at the prominent role that Freemasonry played on both sides of that Civil War, of the so-called Civil War, it is it is curious to say the least.
Yeah, and that's another area Jeremy and I have recently started looking into, was the role of the the B'nai B'rith and the Masonic elements in fomenting the American Civil War. And of course, later on, it was these elements that went on to found and establish organizations like the Anti-Defamation League, and also an organization like the NAACP. It appears it was very much a B'nai B'rith creation. It's all back to that 1913 era where you had the Federal Reserve and the ADL and the NAACP all created right around the same time, and it was over the fear of the reaction to the lynching of Leo Frank, which actually I believe created the Anti-Defamation League. And we've gone and we've started to get into some of this stuff with the Civil War and some of the machinations of that. And there have even been articles published, I think even a publication as mainstream as the Forward has published why aren't these statues of Jewish Confederate figures coming down, and specifically mentioned, I believe, Judah P. Benjamin, who was a significant, of course, figure within the Confederacy who was Jewish ancestry. And of course, we don't even have to begin to wonder why nobody's calling for the Albert Pike statue to be moved in Washington D.C. That's
the only Confederate monument in Washington D.C. is to Albert Pike.
Yeah, exactly.
Who wasn't even wasn't even a great general. He was kind of like right? I don't think
he's also credited as being like one of the original Klansmen.
Yeah. Of course, the Klan, of course, Knights of the Golden Circle, these guys that conspiracy that killed Lincoln. Because in Lincoln itself, you can look at the presidency of Lincoln, and based on this analysis, Lincoln played his role because the conflict was necessary. So Lincoln invades the South, which sparks the war. Because he denied secession to the South, but at the same time you have them fomenting the crisis of secession. This is a great example of a secret society using Freemasonic techniques of infiltration and manipulation to foment a crisis and then exploit the crisis. And of course, Lincoln, I guess maybe Lincoln didn't play ball when he didn't borrow. He issued greenbacks. That's the theory, and so they killed him. He was killed by this Freemasonic conspiracy. I think even standard history says this conspiracy.
Another three-named assassin, John Wilkes Booth, Harvey Oswald. James Earl Rand. Just another three-named assassin. There's probably some type of reasoning. There might be some type of occult reasoning for why they all have three names. You never know.
Yeah. And of course, you mentioned the Mary Phagan case. That's a great example of the South and what was going on. This was the South just recovering from the destruction of the war in the second decade of the 20th century, and Leo Frank, by all accounts, was guilty, but it was the governor who was some people. I guess that some evidence that he was bribed by powerful Jewish interests to grant Leo Frank clemency in lieu of a new trial. And this outraged the people in Georgia because they had given him a trial. He indeed was found guilty. In fact, in the process of trying to be acquitted, he tried to frame two black men. This horrible crime, a 13-year-old girl worked in his pencil factory. Of course, Leo Frank himself was the head of B'nai B'rith in Atlanta. And so that might have been why everyone went to bat for Mr. Frank. The organized Jewish community went to bat for him. He was a big Jew.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because when you think about it, actually think of a lot of the there were a lot of prominent Jewish businesses in the South, I believe, that were very much supportive of segregation, of a lot of the Jim Crow type laws in the South at the time. And you look on top of that, and you look at a lot of the Southern senators who were, the Southern the Southern Manifesto and all that. You look at them in Jewish causes in general, and of course the anti-communist scare, which I think a lot of organized Jewish interests had a big stake into perpetuating the fear of communism, as well as the rise of what people would perceive to be like the genuine manifestation of communism. And these politicians in the South, I think, were very much serving of interest, even to the point to where William Pepper, the biographer of written books on Martin Luther King assassination, is documented that Strom Thurmond, of all people, gave Jesse Jackson a letter to give to Richard Daley in Chicago recommending his services. So,
oh, really?
well, I mean, it's like there's definitely another example of where I guess Pepper has this letter. He's obtained this, and it's in one of his books about the Martin Luther King assassination. But that is just an example of, I think, how even these Southern politicians who were playing the role of opposing the civil rights movement, opposing a lot of the integrationist efforts, were also very much serving the organized interests at the time, particularly when it came to Jewish interests back in the or what would just pass for the Jewish establishment's interests back in the 50s and 60s, as far as fomenting a lot of the divide and conquer agenda.
Yeah, because it was in the wake of the Leo Frank trial and his subsequent lynching. It's marks the beginning of the Jewish war in the South, you could say. And that's when, the Spingarn brothers, I think, financed the NAACP. Who was it who went in there and said there's not a one Negro, and then they're all Jewish lawyers? And
was it Du Bois actually who said that?
Yeah, I think it was D.B. Du Bois went in there and said there aren't any black guys in there; they're all Jewish lawyers. But again, this is another example of a group going in there, and an outside group going there exploiting real problems, but not for the purposes of creating racial harmony, but for actually creating problems and some sort of retribution against the South. Of course, the South then reacts, closes ranks, and that even dynamic plays out in the civil rights movement in the 1950s. Remember Martin Luther King, whose handler was Stanley Levinson, who some people think he was a real author of the letters from a Birmingham jail. This isn't to say that the basic claims of the civil rights movement in the 50s weren't correct. I mean, basic civil rights and these things. Nevertheless, these are things that can be exploited. Of course, this goes towards the destruction, what remained of federalism and limited federal government, because under the pretext of civil rights, the government, and that dates back as far back as the 14th Amendment. The civil right, the post-Civil War amendments, which were actually 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, which were passed at Swords Point, at Bennett Point. So there's a problem with their proper ratification as amendments to the Constitution, because the southern states were occupied states. But nevertheless, the 14th Amendment pretty much gave the federal government a multitude of pretexts to intervene in the states. And now today, the best argument against the 14th Amendment is how it's been subsequently interpreted. I mean, it's no limits on anything in the name of making people be nice to one another, as if
when you look at the civil rights movement or what passes for it here in America, when you really look beneath the surface and you really take all aspects into consideration, it really wasn't a civil rights movement. I think if anything, what it's done is it's created a facade of this idea of, we're this society where everybody's equal and all this and that, but really it's a facade, and there's a number of reasons for that. And with Martin Luther King, it's very clear that he was used in a lot of ways to push the the narrative or the version of civil rights that the establishment wanted to push. I think that's pretty safe to say, and I think
I think it was Nelson Rockefeller who paid him $30,000 to go up into Chicago and start creating trouble in the North. This is an area which he had no familiarity with. The problems in the South were unique to the South. The problems in the North and in places like Chicago were very different. Chicago wasn't segregated. You had ethnic neighborhoods, which was his function, to go up there and destroy what remained of the ethnic neighborhoods. You go into an ethnic neighborhood and say, you're not integrated. Well, of course we're not integrated. We're an ethnic community. And the presumption there is that the ethnic community itself must be destroyed in the name of integration and total equality. Boy, doesn't that sound like a Freemasonic trick?
But and that's true. And I think, though, on the other hand, though, it does appear that he genuinely really did start to go against the interests of a lot of the interests that that those who were handling him had, particularly when he started turning his attention to the war in Vietnam.
Oh yeah, he gives a speech in 1967. A year later, he's killed.
Yeah, and the media, who was very supportive of him up until then, turned on him in a major way after that speech, and because he was starting to link the struggle in America to the struggle globally, planned the major mass march on Washington, D.C., and of course that was something that couldn't happen. And then you had the tent city, which was pretty quickly destroyed after his death. I don't know if you've looked into that. The King was planning the massive march on Washington, the Poor People's March, and that never came to fruition because he was killed. And then there was a makeshift tent city called Resurrection City set up that was pretty quickly just completely destroyed by the feds and by the police in D.C. So that effort never came to fruition. But I believe that there's a great article I would recommend this from the Black Agenda Report website. It's titled Loretta Lynch's Condoleezza Rice with a Law Degree. And a lot of people would not necessarily agree with a lot of people may not agree with all the findings of this article, but I think the basic tenet this article lays out is absolutely true, that what happened in the 50s and 60s is that and of course, I think there's more to it than just this, but the writer of the piece lays out the idea that, you have to, at the very least, create the facade of equality, because you can't fight a propaganda war against the Soviet Union while significant, an entire racial group in your country is living under less than equal circumstances. Mm-hmm. And the theory that's laid out in this article is that those who are elevated to positions of power within the black community, say those who make it to elite positions within government and media, what it is to create the facade that, see, we have equality, when in reality what these figures do is they go into government, they go into media, they go into these prominent positions, and they just continue to perpetuate the same agenda that has been instituted all along. And because they're not really there. You don't see any real criticism of of things like the importation of drugs courtesy CIA, like crack cocaine. Oh. And there's some mention. I think it was obviously there was some publicity in the 90s with Gary Webb's. Yeah, I think Maxine Waters was brought attention to initially,
but
and
then the moment it trailed back to Clinton the Democrat, she lost interest in it.
Oh, no, there you go. And now you look at her now; she's just a borderline raving lunatic at this point.
Yes, but she's rich.
She is rich, but it's even funny. I was even looking through. I was at a library, and they had the archives of a lot of these periodicals. I was looking through some Ebony magazine of all things from the '60s, and there's this big feature article about this black kid who made it to an executive position at Chase Manhattan Bank in Ebony magazine, which is the magazine, probably the magazine in the African American community is treating this like it's just a wonderful achievement. Like, see, he made it to an executive position at Chase Manhattan Bank. It shows what we can do. And like, when you really think about that, you think about just how nefarious of a propaganda piece that is. And but that's an example of what passes for success, and what passes for you're just perpetuating the same agenda that's always been in place. Now it's that we're getting piece of the pie now, and maybe we'll get a few people in positions, but the overall situation that we're in is not going to change. And somebody like King really was becoming somebody who I think was threatening that agenda at the end of his life, and he had to be taken out. And William Pepper has just so thoroughly documented all of that, and it's just, when you really think about it, I mean, it's absolutely evil, the depths that were done to really, at the end of his life, to stop this man from continuing to have a voice. And the way that his legacy is, the way that he's portrayed in the media as being the civil rights hero and all this and that, and meanwhile, just like with Kennedy, they're covering up the reason this man was killed, and they're telling you he's a hero. They're not giving you any of the reasons for things he really did at the end of his life, and it's absolutely sickening when you think about it, what was done and how this has been so twisted.
Well, just these lone nuts came out of nowhere, killed them.
Yeah.
Well, right. Something like because if you look at Martin Luther King and his activism from the late 50s into the early 60s with the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, these things are ultimately they legitimize the system, particularly federal power, centralizing power. But when he gave that speech and he said the U.S. government, my own government, is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, that is undermining the legitimacy of the system. And maybe that is why
funds that were used to finance the war effort to be brought home.
Yes, and remember, it's almost like some of the small. If you listen to like the work, read the work of John Potash, and initially when I heard the theory that characters like Tupac Shakur were assassinated, thinking, well, aren't you exaggerating his importance? Why would the CIA or police departments care about Tupac Shakur, this rap artist? But it turns out that he was making real efforts in trying to bring peace to places like South Central LA by getting the Crips and the Bloods to get out of the armed and drug dealing and arms business. He was making some inroads. White America will laugh at that because they just think of these communities as being hopelessly criminal. But if he was indeed getting people to stop dealing drugs and stop dealing weapons, that upsets a lot of banking interests. And the same way that Martin Luther King would question the legitimacy of the Vietnam War and call out the government, U.S. government, for the murderous institution that it was and what it continues to be, that has severe financial consequences.
And I'll throw out something now that applies to this, and this is just a theory on my part. Jeremy and I, we discussed this, I think, the show we did before this one. A theory that we've had that someone like Colin Kaepernick is very much being stage managed. And I'll say this for this reason, because now Kaepernick and the whole take a knee movement has become entirely politicized, and it's been turned into a battle of what we talked about earlier, where you've got the liberals versus the conservatives, and the conservatives are reacting to the disrespect of the flag and the disrespect of the country being from these rich, wealthy, millionaire football players who don't appreciate what they've been given, versus those who think they're taking a stand against injustice. But if you look at what he did initially, when Kaepernick initially took the knee for the flag before this was getting all this media coverage and stuff, you just look at some of the things he was talking about. He was speaking out against Trump and Clinton equally during the presidential election. He's saying he can't support either of them because neither of them have the interest of our people at heart. And to me, I get the impression just looking at him that I think it's very likely that his activism is being stage managed and manipulated, where I think that there are people in positions of influence that are, I believe, very likely could be keeping him from taking his activism in certain directions, keeping him from information that he would need to know to really make a difference. And I've theorized about that. We talked about that on our show and why we believe that. And so I think we're seeing parallels with that now with someone like King and then someone like a Colin Kaepernick. As I said, I don't know if it's true. It could just be an entirely, he could have been an asset or whatever from the start, but I think there's a very good possibility that his activism's being manipulated to fit this narrative that the elites want to push rather than something that would actually threaten the system.
And also the fact that it would get so much attention by the political establishment, and all of a sudden it's a huge issue. Now, who decides to make it a huge issue? The media does. So this is obviously created because if they don't cover it, it's not big news. And of course, I think the whole idea of the national anthem at a football game goes back to like 2009 as a program that the Pentagon paying the NFL to do this to boost recruitment, supposedly. So yeah. So no one ever thought about the national anthem at a football game. I never,
Dave Zirin, the sports writer for The Nation magazine, he described the national anthem at NFL games having a long tradition going back to the glory days of Jersey Shore and Justin Bieber.
But people are so triggered by it. Man, I've seen it in my own family. They get so triggered by Colin Kaepernick. The same way they get manipulated by that. What was the mediocre quarterback for the Denver Broncos who said a prayer in the end zone or something?
Oh, Tim Tebow.
Yeah, Tim Tebow. And people start to fantasize about, and this is just complete obvious manipulation, but, sports and cultural programming, do you think there's a little cultural programming there with sports? Breads and circuses, you think?
yeah, absolutely. Totally.
Also the whole, sports itself is so manipulated, and I think in many games, the games are massaged and rigged because gambling itself is such a huge part of sports now. In fact, I think total revenue in the United States for professional sports is like $25 billion, and it's estimated that gambling itself globally is $100 to $500 billion a year. And
I believe on that topic that after September 11th, the seventh inning stretch was slowly was changed. Subtly just became the God Bless America. I believe that took place particularly at the Yankees games right after September 11th.
Yeah.
Instead of Take Me Out to the Ball Game and started playing God Bless America. There's a very not so subtle, but at the same time subtle form of propaganda being put in at the baseball game.
Or the Memorial Day where they put on fatigues, uniforms that are fatigued looking. Fatigue hats, and of course, marketing is a big part of this. Of course, marketing is a huge part of it.
It's a lot of veterans uncomfortable to be worshipped in that manner.
It does, and I haven't been to a professional Major League Baseball game in 7 years, but they have this. You have to obligatory get up and salute the troops, and I wouldn't do it.
At the game that last game, which has probably been 4 or 5 years, we had in like the 5th or 6th inning, Budweiser, raise your cup and salute the veteran.
Mm-hmm.
It's like.
And again, the whole thing of flag is when symbols become so important, it's a sign of sort of an insecurity, I think. It's almost like a man who makes himself overly muscular. It's a sign that his masculinity.
Now we've got Judge Roy Moore. You familiar with Judge Roy Moore?
Oh yeah, he's running the
in Alabama, who lost his seat, I believe, as the Chief Justice over the whole
Ten Commandments thing. Yeah.
Now he's come out and said that. Of course, this is just after he said 9/11 was caused because America turned away from God. He's come out and said that that not putting your hand over your heart during the national anthem is against the law somehow, and that it's.
I mean, what?
It's like, what is this? Like, I'm paraphrasing, but I believe that's the headline I saw.
Yeah. I mean, I remember back in the whole Ten Commandment thing, I generally supported him because I didn't think it was a violation of the First Amendment. I don't believe in that interpretation. Nevertheless, whether
the case very closely. I just heard about it, but I'm hearing some of the things he's saying now. And
it wasn't a violation of the Establishment Clause. My point was it wasn't a violation of the Establishment Clause. It's a matter of the states to decide. That was my problem with it. But I mean, what are you going to arrest people for?
But these are the same people who say that they support freedom and they support liberty.
Well, I guess they haven't read their Orwell, have they?
No, I don't think they have. They have just manipulated, completely twisted into something it wasn't.
Yeah. But if you read a book of Brian Toohey, where I interviewed him last year about sports and just how it's manipulated, and if you really think about it, in terms of cultural manipulation, social engineering, obviously the promotion of militarism through sports, particularly through the NFL now. I mean, just as 15 years ago, it just wasn't this way, how it's changed. And it also goes with the huge contract the NFL has with the Pentagon to promote these things. Just the commercials, the programming, of course, the halftime show, which resembles a satanic ritual now. Everyone is just weird. You have again, it's the history of professional sports with gambling and organized crime.
Mention the Super Bowl real quick. Everybody focuses on how degenerate the halftime shows are, right?
Yeah.
Meanwhile, I believe at last year's Super Bowl, wasn't it George Bush and James Baker who did the coin toss?
Yeah. Well, that's yeah. I mean, everyone loves their football.
Oh yeah. And Mike Pence is a patriot. Mike Pence, who sponsored the congressional resolution to get us into the war in Iraq, he's a patriot because he left the football game because the players kneeled or held hands or whatever before the anthem or whatever. It's like, it's just such a joke. It's like,
and also just the obsession of entertainment and sports. It's that takes up so much oxygen. Sure. I mean, everyone's getting all hyperventilating over who's kneeling and who's not kneeling.
Right.
They're not worrying about other things. This is it's like, but people really get so excited about that. They really get upset about it.
Yeah. When there's reasons why there's legitimate reason to be upset about these things, but it's not the reasons they're giving.
Oh yeah. I mean, yeah, exactly. And the whole idea of the history of this. If you listen to the full lyrics of the Star Spangled Banner are really problematic, but no one wants to do that. It's an anthem that celebrates war anyway.
Sure.
But that gets people's emotions flaring. It's war. I mean, it's people have always fallen for that.
Yeah, people don't want to believe that they're what they've fought for and believed in their entire lives is a big lie, is a deception.
Yeah,
and it's amongst people who say parents and grandparents fought in the wars. I mean, that has a major effect on you, and it's very difficult to reach a lot of people with this stuff, and it's hard, but I mean, you just got to be willing at some level to just question what you've been led to believe your entire life. And it's not an easy thing to make. Like, you know, people like us, I can guarantee you, we don't come to the views we have overnight, and it's not an easy thing to come to. And we don't, you know, we don't spout so-called conspiracy theories because it's fun to. It's the last thing from fun to believe this stuff. And that's, I think, and it's got to get to a point to where more people will start to understand what's going on, but I don't know if that's going to happen. So I think that we just have to use our voices as best as we can to at least try to alert people to what's going on.
Well, I mean, you know, they build memorials for a reason, for wars, sure. And that isn't to honor the dead; it's there to propagandize the living.
Kansas City's the National World War I Memorial. So,
yeah, does it say anything about J.P. Morgan and his connections to the banking, London banking, and the reason why we went to war was to bail out J.P. Morgan?
No.
The Hiroshima Memorial here near Arlington National Cemetery, and you got this memorial, this iconic photograph, which was staged, by the way.
Yeah, you've got the wall there too for the Vietnam veterans too.
Yeah, and
propaganda symbols.
And the Vietnam one is more solemn. It's sadder because of the war itself. But World War II, no one ever questions, well, why do we have 10,000 Marines on that island out there in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, dying and killing? Why were they doing that? No one really questions that. They just said, well,
the propaganda is so prevalent that you can't even question the use of nuclear weapons on Japan. I mean, you can't even question that because it was necessary, because it was for the country and all that. It's like you can't even question that. That's just how prevalent the propaganda is. Mm-hmm. But you can't even question why your country uses nuclear weapons, and then we have the gall and the chutzpah to criticize other countries who might be developing nuclear weapons when we're the only country in the world that's ever used one. Of course, our greatest ally has hundreds of nuclear weapons, but no one brings that up.
Oh, wait, are you talking about New England? No.
Oh yeah. But but we're the only country in the world to use a nuclear weapon. We justify it, and then we tell other people that they better not even consider trying to have one.
Well, listen,
a deterrent against our threats against them.
If we didn't nuke Japan, we'd all be speaking Japanese and German.
Right.
You know, like in The Man from High Castle, that show.
Very clearly obvious. And I could see in 5 years, and I hate to think of this, but I could see people years from now saying, although I don't think it would be a victory for us, I don't think it would be a successful for us, I could see people saying, well, if we don't go into Iran, we're all going to be wearing hijabs someday. I mean, we're all going to,
Got to fight them there before they're here, buddy.
Exactly, yes. Rah, yes, we got to get them here or else they're going to come here.
Mm-hmm. And then if they don't come here, well, of course, the federal government and various NGOs will make sure they're shipped over here to places like Minneapolis, St. Paul, and of course that's what's going on in Europe now with these. A lot of these are Jewish organizations that are funding this mass migration into Europe.
Well, we can't talk about that. That's anti-Semitic.
It's
even though Muslims are Semitic people. So we can't talk about that. Arabs are Semitic, but that's anti-Semitic to say that.
Mm-hmm. And that goes back to what we were talking about originally about, of course, creating sort of I think Joe Atwell calls it a gladiatorial pit conditions, where these you have a sort of a demoralized, increasingly depopulated Europe. Being inundated with these foreigners of a foreign culture, everything, and obviously not every event has to be staged. Although I think some of them appear to be staged, false flag attacks. Yeah. But there's gonna be enough incidents in these things where, any fool will tell you this is gonna happen. This was the same thing that was foreseen here in the United States itself. So this migration north,
and it's always Israeli intelligence, well, actually via Rita Katz as a site intelligence, always happens to be, people with close connections to Israel are always the first ones to identify that these were ISIS attacks.
ISIS, yeah.
I believe it was Israeli media's Israeli press that put out the reports that the alleged Vegas shooter was had a Muslim name and all that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But then, I called into the Alex Jones show the other day. He had one of his guests, one of his fill-ins hosting for him, and I mentioned that, and he goes on about, well, everybody just always wants to blame Israel for everything. Meanwhile, they're blaming the left and Antifa for this Las Vegas event. But that's okay to blame the left and to blame the Antifas and to blame the Islamists or blame whoever you want. Just don't blame Israel for anything.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah.
And that's a large portion of what's going on with this control, right, is that the focus is on everything but Israel and everything but Zionism and everything but Jewish power.
Well, it's strange because there's a lot of criticism at the same time, but they don't. I think you mentioned this. How things some of the evidence suggesting Israeli involvement in 9/11 that's been uncovered. They were tailing the alleged hijackers to the final, up in the lead up to the day of the operation. You have, of course, you have the whole thing with Larry Silverstein and the authority, the Port Authority of New Jersey and New York.
Yes. By the way, the head of the New York Port Authority in the lead up to September 11th, Lou Eisenberg, I believe, was very heavily involved in the Trump inaugural committee. I think he may have been overseeing the finances of the Trump inaugural committee. And Trump's talked about having a great relationship with Larry Silverstein, how terrific of a guy he is. I'm sure you could hear Trump in your head talking about somebody being a terrific guy. Yeah. And then Ronald Lauder, who's the head of the World Jewish Congress, who probably is the foremost Jewish member of like a major global Jewish organization that is defensive of Trump, who defends Trump, along with Morton Klein of the Zionist Organization of America. Ronald Lauder was involved with the Port Authority around that time as well. I believe he specifically specialized in privatization efforts around that time, and now he's heading the World Jewish Congress, and he's probably Trump's number one Jewish backer as far as defending him from allegations of anti-Semitism and all that.
Mm-hmm. The Kushners, his son-in-law, the Kushner family, whose father is a convicted felon who has that horrible scandal where he tried to set up his...
Yahoo talks about, Jared sleeping in Jared Kushner's bed when Jared Kushner was a teenager when he was prime minister in the 90s. Mm-hmm. And this brings into another aspect that doesn't really get talked about is that, and I can't prove this, okay? This cannot be proven. This is something that we've talked about on a lot of our programs, Jeremy and I. My gut tells me that I'm really coming to the belief that Hillary Clinton was actually the designated loser of this presidential campaign. I'm starting to believe that it was actually designed for Trump to win. It's hard to prove that. Like, I don't have any.
Oh, I know. Yeah.
But it does appear to me that if I think that there definitely for sure was, and when you talk about, and this brings into a whole other can of worms, when you talk about Russian collusion in the election and all that, it's obviously the way that the media is painting it, obviously is complete BS, obviously, the way that's being portrayed. But when you think about it, there is a connection between prominent figures in Russia, closely associated with Vladimir Putin, and people very close to Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel, and it extends to this media empire here in the U.S. that has been established around sites such as Breitbart and, of course, the Drudge Report, which broke the Monica Lewinsky scandal to hurt Bill Clinton. Netanyahu, I believe, probably hates the Clinton family because Netanyahu always saw the Clintons as a threat to his interests. And remember, Bill Clinton worked against Netanyahu to get Ehud Barak elected in 1999. Mm-hmm. And there's evidence that Lewinsky was actually an agent of the Mossad who was put in there to compromise Bill Clinton. And so I look at it, and I do believe that, there may not be anything to the Russian collusion as far as like Putin trying to steal American democracy or whatever. That's a complete fabrication, obviously. But it doesn't mean that there wasn't interference. And once again, I'm not verifying this as fact, but I think that a strong case could be made that if there was some type of foreign involvement in the American election, it could very well have been Israel in conjunction with a lot of these Republican governments that could suppress certain votes in certain areas. And I do think that should be strongly considered, and I think that there's a lot to that, and a lot of noise was made about Trump potentially being an enemy of Israel during the during the campaign. A lot of people within the alt-right movement have pushed that narrative that Trump is somehow an enemy of organized Jewish interests, and and people like David Duke and Richard Spencer have pushed this narrative that Trump is a threat to the organized Jewish interests and that they're all trying to stop him from getting elected, and he only got a fraction of the vote, when in reality he got about 25% of the Jewish vote, which is more than John McCain received, more than George W. Bush received his first election, the equal amount that George W. Bush received the second time. He won the Orthodox community in New York City, where Clinton was senator, from a 9-to-1 ratio. Mm-hmm. So clearly there was not as much opposition among the Jewish establishment to Trump as has been made out to be.
Yeah. And now with Trump, with any election, I would have to assume there has to be a lot of foreign interest in a U.S. election. The same way the U.S. has involved itself in every election overseas in its own way. Especially the financial ties of New York and London, particularly going back to the rape of Russia in the 90s, and the use of certain oligarchs and these things to transfer the resources, ownership of the resources that occurred, and of course that it had to have filtered into real estate at some point. There's Trump. There's talk about some of Trump's these condominiums or hotels where a lot of Saudi money is laundered through there. Trump will be able to sell condominiums for a high price. And that's one way. Real estate is a great way to launder money. In the same way that the casinos are. So, a lot of transactions can occur just below the radar, which the media doesn't seem to be too curious about. They'd rather focus on what part of the female anatomy that Trump is bragging about grabbing or something.
When you think about that, I think that probably when you consider all of the American Jewish Zionist establishment, when it comes to these elite power players, I don't think you can find a more bloodthirsty, more passionately bloodthirsty supporter of Zionism and the Jewish state of Israel than Sheldon Adelson. And of course, Sheldon Adelson gave. How much did he give to Trump? I think he gave the biggest inaugural gift to any inaugural campaign in American history. And once again, where does he come from? He comes from the casino community, the same place that Donald Trump comes from. And it's just, these are the most hardline supporters of Israel and Zionism. It makes the politicians in D.C. and many of the media elites just look dovish on this whole matter.
Yeah, he's kind of like the right-wing analog to, what's that guy, Haim Sabin or something, that media mogul?
And Sheldon Adelson are very similar, just like George Soros and the Koch brothers are increasingly George Soros and Robert Mercer, who appears to be the major benefactor behind Steve Bannon's efforts.
Mercer, no, what's his? Is he in Las Vegas?
No, Robert Mercer, I believe, is in the New York, New Jersey area. He made a company called Renaissance Technologies, but over the past decade or so, he's emerged as a major funder of GOP causes, and he is one of the major benefactors behind big infusion of money into Breitbart in recent years. He's most likely bankrolling Steve Bannon's campaign right now against the Republican establishment, and it was Mercer who basically I would recommend your viewers to a documentary put out by the Real News Network about the Robert Mercer and Robert Mercer's role as being Robert and Rebecca Mercer. That's Robert Mercer's daughter, as being the people behind Trump. And around the time of the Republican convention, there was a major shift in the Trump campaign, and I think a couple people were let out. I think Paul Manafort and a couple others were out of the campaign as being the heads of the campaign, and Steve Bannon became the head of the Trump campaign, and David Bossie, who's very closely connected with him, and Kellyanne Conway, who was the current, I forget what her role is in the administration now, they were placed in the primary positions of controlling the campaign. And this came with the major infusion of money from this Robert Mercer. And what these people all have in common is they're all connected to the Council for National Policy, which is the secretive conservative group which basically controls the right wing of the Republican Party. This is another area that Nick Spiro has been very, very thorough in documenting the history of.
Yeah, it's supposed to be like the anti-CFR, but if you examine it, it's infiltrated by the CFR.
It really is. It really is. It's very much like a domestic version of the Council on Foreign Relations for the for the conservative side. And
for the new right, people like,
yes, and they're very, very key in this whole new right, this control right. And I guess that the narrative is that Breitbart had initially been behind Ted Cruz, and a lot of these Council for National Policy connected people who have made up like the right wing of the GOP that's at war with the establishment, I use that in quotations, chose Donald Trump over Ted Cruz because they saw him as a better instrument to fulfill their agenda. And so this was, I think, was the key to Trump in the general election, was this shift in the campaign, which took place after the right around the time of the Republican convention when Steve Bannon took over the Trump campaign. And he basically fed through his connections at Breitbart, where he had been CEO and he's CEO again. He basically gave Donald Trump to the part of the conservative base that was still somewhat skeptical of him. I believe that.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, because no one, I mean, as recently as 10 years ago, no one would have associated Donald Trump with being a conservative.
No, actually, no, not at all. And that was actually very carefully. And at one point when Trump was hosting The Apprentice, he was extremely popular within the black community. And then he comes out and he starts questioning Obama's birth certificate. And it's around this time that I think he's really getting the itch to start considering a run for president. He comes out and questions the birth certificate. His approval ratings go down within the black community. And in a way, it was perfect because it set him up for what he's doing now, where he's constantly like triggering the black community with his comments and with the things he's saying. And he was very pro what you call amnesty, and very much pro for like illegal immigration years ago. And he was pro abortion, and he was pro all this stuff. But now over the last 5 years, he's just completely been made from a social liberal into a grassroots conservative hero.
Mm-hmm.
Of even social conservatism, which is such a joke when you look at his history.
No, yeah. I mean, yeah. And of course, Obama is another example, a great example of one of these black guys who are, catapulted to the top to make everyone feel good, make the black community feel good. But then,
go ahead.
But if you look at the employment rates, crime, incarceration, same thing under the Clintons. And if you're familiar with the work of Catherine Austin Fitts and the privatization of the prison system and the role that played in destroying certain communities for subsequent gentrification, this is sort of a domestic application. So this destabilization of areas to lower the property values, and then you can come in and buy it up at a song. And this was done through a crackdown using the drug war. And the idea is you just go into communities, you seed it with drugs, then you occasionally have crackdowns, you arrest a bunch of people who really can't have lawyers. Usually they're poor and black, so they can't really. So they plea out, they go to prison for a long time, for a few years. In the meantime, their warm bodies fulfill the contractual obligations for these privatized prisons, and as many of them are more or less sold off to slave labor because they work, they build the Kevlar materials for the Pentagon. I mean, it's really, and to think, I mean, it's hard to imagine that people actually devising a system like this, but this is what someone with an MBA and a sociopath or a psychopath with an MBA would devise a system like that. And apparently, according to Catherine Austin Fitts, this was sort of, I think this is in her article, The Aristocracy of Stock Profits, how this was a business model that was developed by Dillon Reed, the banking house, Dillon Reed, in conjunction with the Clinton Gore's plan to reinvent government. And part of reinventing government was the privatization of prisons, which needed the contracts needed certain occupancy rates to be maintained in prisons. And what if prevailing crime rates don't produce the bodies? Well, you go out and you find the bodies, and you do that through these various crackdowns or by seeding these areas with drugs, which, if familiar with the work of Gary Webb and others, why that was being done, not only to fund black operations, but also going back to the days of the Opium Wars, is spreading opium among the masses for to destroy the culture, and also at the same time to opiate society, which Aldous Huxley writes about in Brave New World.
I think Cornel West summed it up best about Obama. He was a Rockefeller Republican in blackface. And I think in a lot of ways, Donald Trump actually serves as the hope and change for the right in a lot of ways.
Well, yeah. I mean, obviously going into the election, the system itself, again, people are feeling alienated, rightfully so. They're questioning legitimacy of the political process. Throw a guy up there like Trump, all of a sudden people kind of rope back into it.
Yeah.
And that's manipulating everyone's emotions. I mean, that'll buy the system a few more years, and then they'll throw someone else up there who will, get them all excited. The same way that Obama provided hope,
Did you want to get into the topic of the alt-right for a few minutes?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So, as I said, in part of a lot of the work and the research and the conclusions that Jeremy and I have come to in analyzing this controlled right, we've had some conversations about the alt-right, which is because if you've been paying attention to the war within the conservative base, that basically the pro-Trump base has been split, and what makes up much of the pro-Trump base has been split into two categories. You've got the alt-light, and you've got the, quote, alt-right. Mm-hmm. Now, the alt-light are the openly pro-Zionist, pro-Israel fanatics, like people within the Breitbart community and those closely affiliated with Alex and InfoWars, and people who have been promoted and elevated to positions of prominence through that network, like Mike Cernovich, for example. They're the alt-light, Milo Yiannopoulos, that crowd. They're openly Zionist to the point of fanaticism and pro-Israel. Then you've got the alt-right, and the alt-right is more perceived as being, anti-Jewish and anti-Zionist and openly anti-Semitic, and led by people like Richard Spencer and David Duke, and the Daily Stormer, which is led by Andrew Anglin, which gets all this nonstop, constant media coverage as being like the boogeyman of white supremacism and neo-Nazism in America. I do think a close look at some of these figures within the alt-right, though, shows that this is yet another controlled opposition movement. You mentioned Regnery a couple weeks ago when you're talking about William Buckley and his book, which put him on the map, as was God and Man at Yale. It was published by Regnery. And you mentioned Regnery is receiving the CIA funding as documented by E. Howard Hunt, I believe, in his memoirs. Mm-hmm. And turns out, I don't know if you knew this, but Richard Spencer's think tank is the National Policy Institute. It was founded by a member of the Regnery family, William Regnery II, one of the sons of Henry Regnery, the founder of Regnery. And Spencer's been catapulted into the celebrity for the alt-right, and there have been a number of publications that have written about his close relationship with William Regnery II that continues to this day, and all of Spencer's connections, and he's really been made into this media celebrity, much like Andrew Anglin and the Daily Stormer, and of course David Duke. And I find David Duke to be a particularly interesting figure. I've talked a lot we and Jeremy have focused quite a bit on him, and I believe it's important to understand what it appears that David Duke represents when you really take a really critical look at his past and what he advocates for. I'll just lay it out real quick with David Duke. He his first foray into the national scene was as a student at LSU, where he wore an SS uniform and held up a sign saying, "Gas the Chicago 7." I think that's when he first got national publicity, was holding up a sign saying, "Gas the Chicago 7," wearing an SS uniform. From there, he goes over to Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War, where his father is stationed as I believe a contractor for the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID.
Well, that's very interesting.
Notorious organization as far as criminality.
Didn't Barack Obama's mother also work for aid?
It's I believe she did. She was definitely at the very least affiliated with the CIA in some capacity. I'm not sure if it was USAID or not. May have been, but anyway, Duke's official capacity was teaching English to Laotian, to anti-communists in Laos who were fighting the Viet Cong. But actually, David Duke's campaign biography that was published for support his campaign for governor of Louisiana in 1991, it was written in that David Duke flew flights for Air America. which of course is the notorious drug smuggling operation, the drug running operation. Now, this hasn't been verified, and there were people who actually came out who claimed to have flown for Air America who say he never did, and that was published in some mainstream publications. I believe this was used as a means to prove his patriotism and his service to the country. My question is, if you're trying to prove your service and your patriotism, why would you just happen to pick to promote an organization that was notorious for, drug running operations, as what you did during the Vietnam War? And I honestly can believe that he did it. There's no proof that he did, but I can believe it. And it's just interesting that he selected Air America, of all things, to put in his campaign biography for governor.
Yeah.
And then from there,
and I mean, as far as records goes, there wouldn't be any. I mean, Air America was a cutout for CIA. I guess whether it's through sheep dipping or something, I don't know. But he's claiming that, but he hasn't produced anything to prove. But then again, you might not have anything to prove working for an operation like that.
And then from there, he goes on to be the national head and the face of the Ku Klux Klan, the Grand Wizard of the National Ku Klux Klan, which has been well documented as being filled with feds and Fed agents of all types. Yeah. And Dave Emery, there's a radio host named Dave Emery who's done a number of programs documenting elements of David Duke's past. You go into YouTube and you type in Dave Emery, Emory, David Duke, you could find some of the programs that he's done. And he talks about in one of his programs how there was a book written about the Ku Klux Klan, I believe, back in 1978. I've never been able to access this book, but in this book, I guess the writer of the book, who did a number of interviews with Klan members and spent time with members of the Klan, came to the conclusion that he was likely an FBI informant, and she based it on the fact that while his other fellow Klan members were going down and going to prison for various things, he always managed to get off. And I guess he also managed to visit the UK and get out scot-free despite having the UK government and Scotland Yard wanting to keep him out. And so this writer of this book came to the conclusion that he was likely an FBI informant. And from there, Duke, have you heard of Operation Red Dog before?
I've heard of it. This is
okay.
Is that like PatCon or something?
It was an aborted effort, and it was by right-wing, far-right, like paramilitary, to overthrow the government of Dominica, which was, of course, in the Caribbean, and that, I guess, would be a precursor to set off a lot of the Reagan administration's actions in Central America. Mm-hmm. And this was 1981. Duke was the financial money man who was putting together the financial elements of this operation.
So this was claimed to be like a freelance operation?
It's a good question. It was offshoots outside of the government, I'm sure, with all sorts.
So it's like the Safari Club and these
like private citizens were going to overthrow a government. That's my understanding of it. And closely affiliated with Duke was a man named Don Black, who was a ally of his within the Klan, who went on to found the Stormfront website, which for years has been the most prominent white nationalist website. Anyway, the operation fell apart, and but Duke was the money man for this. And the host I mentioned before, Emery, he's laid this out, very, very detailed breakdown of Operation Red Dog and the factors involved in it and the people involved in it, particularly David Duke. And so that's his background. And then from there he goes on to be a prominent Senate and gubernatorial candidate. And then most recently he's recreated himself in the media presence as a household name with the rise of Donald Trump. You remember the controversy over Trump refusing to he wouldn't disavow David Duke. I'm sure you've heard about that.
Yeah, Trump claimed he didn't know who he was or something, if I recall.
Yes.
Yeah.
Where that came from was David Duke on his radio show, hosted by Jeff Rense, or owned by Jeff Rense, his media outlet, which I think is another shady character. Duke was on his radio program saying that, or he's on the Rense network. Duke has his own program on there, and he said that not voting for Trump is treason to your heritage as a European. So it's treasonous to your European heritage to not vote for Trump. So he gave basically the media the ammunition to use to lump Trump in with Duke. And a lot of people would say, well, this is designed to hurt Donald Trump. And I think much like the whole CNN thing, I think that in a strange way this actually benefited Donald Trump. And the reason why I say that is because it gave the desired reaction, I think. It caused that base of the population that supports Duke, that supports white nationalism, all this, to get behind him. And then the portion that already believes that are like abhorrent, that thinks that, they're horrified by someone like Duke, but they support Trump, it buys into the persecution narrative that, Trump's being persecuted by the media and we have to support him. And so just before Charlottesville, most recently, this is Duke's most recent foray into the media spotlight, is just before the Charlottesville rally with all the chaos that broke out, just happens to have cameras in front of him as he makes the statement that the rally in Charlottesville is the fulfillment of Donald Trump's campaign promise. So I believe he's a very key figure in getting the dissident right behind Donald Trump. And Duke has never, ever been on the record talking about these connections that Trump has that we've discussed tonight, that other people have discussed. None of these figures in this alt-right that have any type of major platform have discussed any of these connections. They're so anti-Jewish and so anti-Zionist, yet they're not discussing all of these connections that Donald Trump has, these hardcore Likudniks and supporters of the most right-wing, most fanatical Israeli policies, both domestic and foreign.
Well, I think Richard Spencer actually endorses.
Richard Spencer has said that he admires Israel, and I think he actually called himself a white Zionist.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, it becomes, I think with David Duke, a lot of people will think of this as a strange comparison to make. Jeremy and I have talked about this, that David Duke and Noam Chomsky are very similar, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Whereas you've got Noam Chomsky, who obviously covers up for Jewish power, like he completely plays gatekeeper and keeping people away from understanding Jewish power and how Zionism works and all that, with his activism where it's not the Jews, it's not the Zionists and all that. David Duke, I think, zeroes in on Jews to a point to where it just sounds obsessive and where it turns people off. And what Duke and Chomsky have in common is that on the major issues, when it comes to the John F. Kennedy assassination, when it comes to September 11th, when it comes to, secret societies and major think tanks and the role in shaping society and shaping everything that goes on in our world, they have nothing to say about those topics, and they're very, very silent about them. And I've told you earlier that David Duke's been on the record saying that the Rothschilds are irrelevant and that they have no power or influence, that they're from the past. They don't have any relevance in our modern era. And so I think that understanding someone like David Duke, and I could be wrong about this, it would be interesting to actually hear him address these issues. I've tried to talk to him on Twitter, but he blocked me pretty quickly. I think that understanding someone like this, I think, is very important, understanding how our system in general works, because if you can understand how those portraying themselves as the opposition operate, then I think you've got a pretty good understanding of how the system in general operates.
Yeah, the Joe Atwell's concept of the lifetime actor, I think, is a good point of analysis. When
I think of people like Duke and Noam Chomsky and Donald Trump, for that matter, I think of the concept of the lifetime actor. I think that's a very apt description.
Yeah. And what you're saying is some of the more off-putting or offensive criticism of organized Jewish power, which does indeed exist, and it is a factor in the power structure. It tends to delegitimize legitimate criticism of AIPAC. Yeah.
And in the process, you're taking focus away from, say, September 11th activism or the very real machinations that go on behind the scenes with these organizations and these think tanks that are very much affiliated with a lot of these more Masonic type deals. And you get the real power structure that really runs the world, which is very, very, very much Jewish elements, obviously, that are very influential, but it's not just Jews and it's not just that. And his whole shtick is that it's just the Jews and it's just all this and that, and that they're dominating. Like, for example, let's take this Harvey Weinstein example. And what is his MO? All he wants to talk about is the fact that Harvey Weinstein's Jewish and that this is Jewish behavior and all that. Meanwhile, the real scandal is that this is something that is just. It's as American as apple pie within the Hollywood culture, what people like Harvey Weinstein are doing, and yet his whole focus is Harvey Weinstein's Jewish, so he's bad, and it's like. And
also, it tends to you have this this feminist narrative being played out. When avoiding the what Hollywood really represents, what it is.
That's what besides doing, and I think that this is a very much a controlled narrative, and there's been some Mike King at Tomato Bubble, who publishes the Anti-New York Times. I think he's put together a convincing, maybe it's not true, but a convincing case that this is very much a manufactured event, that perhaps some of the people that are that perhaps this was a takedown by various elements within like the right arm of the power structure against the known liberal like Harvey Weinstein, who was and it plays into this narrative of dividing the population against it. Because now you've got this manufactured outrage that Hollywood's so liberal, and the reason why Hollywood's so degenerate is because it has liberal values. And meanwhile, you've got the other side, which is the progressive side's pushing the whole idea that this is just an example of male privilege, and women are the victims. And this is male privilege, and we got to stop male privilege. So you've got another paradigm here, another manufactured event designed to divide the populace against each other, and you either fall into the trap that it's liberalism that's bringing down society, or it's this male privilege and it's this horrible men treating women like this. When meanwhile, most of these people that are in Hollywood and the media, they know that this stuff is extremely prevalent within Hollywood. I'm sure they've known a lot of these people that are now wringing their hands and in condemnation have known what Harvey Weinstein's been doing for decades probably, yet now they're so outraged about it and they're using it to fulfill an agenda. And then you get the David Dukes and the trolls like Andrew Anglin of the Daily Stormer, who only thing they seem to care about, Harvey Weinstein's Jewish, so he's bad.
Yeah.
So it's just a completely manufactured. Meanwhile, you can't talk about Donald Trump being connected to the most hardcore Likud supporting purveyors and promoters and those who carry out the most hardcore right-wing policies that define Israel and the Jewish state. You can't talk about that, but you can talk all day about Harvey Weinstein being Jewish. You can talk all day about how the Jews are destroying our society, but you can't talk about how the guy who you say it's treasonous to not vote for is literally been associated with the most hardcore Jewish Zionists his entire life. You can't talk about that.
Well, you have to. To do that, you'd have to get into sort of the details of this this criminal syndicate that runs the world.
I think the role of someone like that is to keep people away from really understanding how it works. That's what I believe.
It's the same way that the Monica Lewinsky scandal was used as a diversion, the sex to not looking to Mena, Arkansas, and the Clinton's real. I mean, Clinton Clinton probably was guilty of rape. He's probably done it. But the point is, same thing with the, the guy down in Florida and,
Epstein,
and that does, I think it does reveal sort of a blackmail operation, human compromise system. That's kind of it.
It's so interesting how the Trump base makes it all about Hillary Clinton, while they either ignore altogether or they completely dismiss Trump's decades-long friendship with Epstein. It's just funny how that works. And, Trump's going to get rid of the pedophilia, yet Trump has been openly in negotiations with the head of DynCorp, which has been directly linked to child trafficking, to oversee a restructuring of the intelligence agencies. You can go in, there are some mainstream articles detailing the negotiations at Trump, but supported by Steve Bannon, by the way, Mr. Populist. They want to bring Feinberg from DynCorp, CEO, to help structure the intelligence agencies. It's much like having Eric Prince come in and privatize the military effort in Afghanistan, which doesn't appear that's going to be the case now, at least at the moment. But we're going to get the pedophiles out. We're working with the head of DynCorp, and we're going to have an America First non-interventionist foreign policy, yet we're working with the head of Blackwater.
Yes.
Now, Eric Prince is talking about running for Congress, and he has the full backing of Steve Bannon and Breitbart.
Eric Prince, yeah.
So,
I mean, it's something else. It really is. Really? One thing that's interesting is you mentioned, the whole Lewinsky thing with Clinton and how that dominated the headlines. What he did not do, what was sex, what wasn't sex, and these things. Well, of course, Ken Starr, the special prosecutor who focused on the investigation and went through these, when he deposed Monica Lewinsky and Clinton, went through excruciating detail about what was sex, what wasn't sex, and the whole nation
depends on what your definition of is
and subjected to that. Of course, the whole time the whole investigation, the Whitewater, and this, of course, if you investigate Whitewater and the financial shenanigans going on in Arkansas in the 1980s, opens up the Mena, Arkansas scandal, which exposes the Bushes, the CIA, and the cocaine smuggling with Barry Seal and all that stuff. He didn't investigate any of that, of course. Now, if Ken Starr, from what I understand, was the assistant to William French Smith, the Attorney General, who wrote the memorandum of understanding with the CIA that gave them the green light to not the case officers to ignore drug dealing in the run-up into the dirty wars in Central America.
Any of that stuff during the Lewinsky scandal. Yeah. No one.
And Ken Starr. What was Ken Starr's true job? And of course, Ken Starr is the great nephew of Cornelius Vander Starr.
Wow.
Which it was CV Starr, which became AIG.
Oh, wow. The ties that bind you together, yeah.
So
kind of like you mentioned Vander Starr. It's kind of like Anderson Cooper of CNN being directly related to the Vanderbilt family.
Yes. Yeah. You see how it works. But you mentioned, of course, the Zionists and these things. They want to sensationalize, this ravening anti-Semites, borderline Nazis criticizing Jews because the Jews want to promote that. Jewish organizations want to promote that, as opposed to sort of the sober criticism of it's the same reason why some books you can't get. I interviewed Germar Rudolph, who was the.
I've heard of Germar Rudolph. Speaking of which, Ursula Haverbeck, 88 years old, is being convicted of Holocaust denial again. How absurd is that? They're going to ruin an 8-year-old woman's life over an opinion of something that took place 70 years ago.
Yeah, now, he's written a series of these books, very analytical study of scrutinizing the Holocaust narrative, and it is very problematic.
Had Ernst Zundel, who just died.
Yeah, there's Zundel. Now, his books are banned at Amazon. Okay, but they're very scientific, rational critique of the narrative, scientific evidence and arguments. I've read his work and talked to the guy. His books you can't get on Amazon. But you can get Alfred Rosenberg's Myth of the 20th Century. You can get the Turner Diaries. You can get so they want that out there, but they don't want the good stuff. I mean, this the reasonable stuff out there because they don't want reasonable critics getting.
Have you ever taken time to look at and visit the Daily Stormer website?
From time to time, I'm.
It's just a big old troll site.
Yeah.
Going on and on about women and about Jews and about just all this stuff, and they've actually pushed a concept called white Sharia law, which I guess is basically women need to live under Islamic law because women are destroying society and all this.
So I'm a critic of feminism and its origins. I think that itself is controlled opposition, very destructive to the family. It's. But then again, the reaction to it is the Playboy culture, which is promoted by the same power structure. This is all dialectic.
When you see this reaction, it's like nobody's going to take that seriously, but they're the ones that get the publicity in the media.
No. But it's funny because if you look at the Zionism, I mean, a while back I had Ry Dawson on the show, and we were talking about the Zionist cabal at the New York Port Authority. He focused when we were talking about it, and he gets into all these names and how the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey have been taken over by these Jewish businessmen working, the Kushners. What was the name?
Lou Eisenberg, Ronald Lauder of World Jewish Congress appears to have been involved in that whole operation.
Yeah. Now, it's kind of funny because I'm going to test this out. That's sort of a microcosm of what's happened in the United States in general because. If you look at Zionism, its history, it dates back to the British Empire and Lord Palmerston and British Freemasonry, being used as an excuse to somehow get access to the Middle East. And Zionism itself has served the Rothschild interest. And the Rothschilds? Well, the Rothschilds, they came to power primarily in the early 19th century. There's the whole thing with Waterloo, but through banking and things like that, and the increasing indebtedness of the British aristocracy. So much so by the 19th century, because of debt, that the Rothschilds have been able to pretty much take over the British state for banking interests. You can say the Rothschilds are sort of shorthand just for banking interests. They're the dominant banking family. For ones to know, they became the dominant banking family in Europe. And it's hard to separate Zionism from the British Empire, nor is it you can't separate it from British Freemasonry, because British Freemasonry was the British Empire. It was it was the takeover of the lodges in the 1720s, and the Freemasonic system was used as sort of a technology for subversion and secrecy to engage in intelligence operations, subversion on the continent, and these things, and so it fanned out throughout the world. So this is sort of a method of running the world, so to speak, and also in the ability to engage in high-level criminality and malfeasance without getting caught. It's organized crime, whatever. The mafia runs on very similar principles, supposedly. So it's not hard to conceptualize. This is the way you really do business and how you run the world, way a criminal syndicate would run the world. But nevertheless, here it's a question of, was Zionism a tool of British Freemasonry or British Empire, and has the tail begun to wag the dog, so to speak? Because in the United States, you had the same problem. You had the WASP dominance, the WASP elite running the CIA and these things, skull and bones. But then in the 60s and 70s, you sort of have the decline of WASP power and the rise of Jewish power, particularly after the Six-Day War in 1967. And so now, is it, now that maybe Zionism has become more prominent lately, because people pass, Nelson Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller III died. Now you have these people die off, and then a change occurs. And if you look at the Port Authority of New York, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey was originally utilized by the Rockefellers, namely to build these monstrosities called the Twin Towers, during a recession when there was a surplus of commercial property. So it was a huge embezzlement scam, probably. Nevertheless, of course, then they want to get rid of it. Well, what a great way to get rid. One way to get rid of it is you encapsulate it in a false terrorist attack. But if you look at the Port Authority of New York, you in the 70s and 80s, you see these Jewish businessmen sort of come in and take it over and run it as a criminal enterprise. Is that sort of like what's happening now internationally? What do you think?
That's a good question, and that reminds me of another September 11th conspirator who's very close to Donald Trump, Rudy Giuliani, and how, I believe it was Michael Collins Piper, who also wrote about Who Towers Behind Trump, who wrote about how Giuliani, as an ethnic Italian, was used to basically bring the hammer down on the ethnic Italian mobsters and bring in the hardcore Zionist mobsters in to take over the city in the 80s as a U.S. prosecutor. It very much rings similarly to that, and that sounds like a pretty accurate microcosm in a lot of ways. And of course, you had, just after the Six-Day War, you had the neoconservatives rose to prominence. Those who had been Bolsheviks, like Irving Kristol, who was a Bolshevik who became a neoconservative, and they used people like Senator Scoop Jackson to push the neoconservative agenda. And then, of course, the neoconservatives lined up in opposition to Carter, and then really insulated themselves into the Reagan-Bush administration. I say Reagan-Bush because it really was the Bush administration. I think Bush pretty much had 3 terms as president in the 80s. And then from there it became a power, such the prominent what you see now. And I think that's a very good construct. And I also like the idea of Zionism. It goes beyond just like Jewish machinations, and it's more than that. And that's what a lot of people don't understand, is that it's more than just like the Jews or whatever. And I'm glad that we're having this conversation about this, that you laid this out. And I think it's a very apt, accurate what's going on here today. But now we've even got, it appears, a war within neoconservatism, and that's very fascinating. Because you're seeing the previous neocon establishment is being replaced by this. The Trump, those behind Trump now, and that's that's another fascinating thing that's playing out.
Yeah, because you had William Kristol, who Valley said, was that thing where if it's Trump versus the deep state, I side with the deep state.
Yeah, and it was David Horowitz, who's one of the most radically anti-Muslim, pro-Israel commentators you'll ever hear, who wrote the article for Breitbart, which Steve Bannon was labeled as being anti-Jewish for, titled Bill Kristol, Republican spoiler renegade Jew. It's like, it's just an infight within the organized Jewish community is what this whole Trump versus the deep state narrative is.
And Horowitz played his part in the 60s in radicalizing, promoting the Black Panthers, and then you had the breakup of the Black Jewish Alliance in the 60s. And then
Horowitz. Yeah. It's funny, Alex Jones credits Horowitz with making him understand that the real conspiracy is not false flags to blame Muslims to create a perpetual state of war. Rather, David Horowitz has shown Alex Jones that the real conspiracy is that Islam and the left are teaming up to bring us down.
Islam and the left.
Yes. Yeah, he's had these fawning interviews with David Horowitz where he'll say the most ridiculously just over-the-top, evil, pernicious propaganda about Muslims, and Alex Jones will be on air openly saying that I credit you with waking me up to the real conspiracy.
Mm-hmm.
It's so absurd, but that's who's controlling this narrative, and those are the people who we're supposed to believe that that Trump and Breitbart and Steve Bannon are anti-Semitic because David Horowitz supports them and criticizes Bill Kristol.
And at the same time, you have the U.S. Of course, you have NATO and the CIA supporting groups like the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, and ISIS in Syria, who are taking down a secular government. Trying to depose a secular government and creating the mayhem in Syria, also destroying these historic Holy Land sites. And the Christian Zionists aren't saying a word about it. They're supposedly,
Oh, by the way, all the Christian broadcasters are over in Israel right now.
Oh, that's great. Doing their, going to the Wailing Wall and doing that tour and all that
Probably.
stuff.
I mean, they're all having their convention over there, and they're all meeting with Netanyahu, and Netanyahu's telling them how wonderful of friends they are to Israel. Meanwhile, Christians can't even, meanwhile, how badly persecuted are Christians in Israel. But here's the thing they don't understand. They don't understand that there's Palestinian Christians. It's like they don't care about them.
Yeah. Sir Hans Serhan is a Palestinian Christian.
Yeah, exactly. But their suffering doesn't count.
Well, that's the Christian community. I was you hear that in church, where they'll talk about the beleaguered Christian community in the Middle East and destabilization, but the church itself is silent on who's creating the destabilization. And I said, well, shouldn't you speak about why the Christian community is beleaguered and under assault in these areas? And it's because these Islamic groups, which are funded by the CIA and NATO countries like Turkey and Israel, these things. And, then Donald Trump will talk about how Iran is allied with ISIS. So what? What are you talking about?
Trump made, he's rehashing some of the worst of the Bush administration propaganda, and he's going even further than that. And what makes it so dangerous, I think, what Trump's saying, even more dangerous than when it was in the Bush era, is that Trump has got, the Bush administration, they at least pretended to be tolerant of Islam and say nice things about Muslims and all that. We're fighting a war on terror, but we're not fighting a war on Islam. These people are all about this is a war against Islam, this is a war against them. And you've got a whole base of people who literally believe that, Hezbollah is smuggling terrorists over the borders and all that. And it's like, this is an extremely dangerous time for President of the United States be saying all this stuff about Iran and about Islam, about Muslims, because his base believes it. And unlike the Bush administration, which I'm not in any way, shape, or form defending the evils of the Bush administration, of course, but unlike that administration, this administration makes no bones about democracy and all that, and they don't pretend to be tolerant of Muslims. They're just whipping their base into just all-out absolute hatred of these people.
Yeah, and what they'll do is you'll have, in the meantime, you have programs, whether it's to NGO or even the federal government, they'll bring in refugees from these areas and plant them in the middle of the town, which will causes resentment. But
if you criticize Trump, people will ask you, oh, well, you must have wanted to have Hitler as president. Yeah. No, it just doesn't mean that just because as bad as she is, it doesn't mean that we're going to support another evil alternative. Well, and in a lot of ways, I think Trump can get away with things that Clinton never could have gotten away with.
Well, that's the dilemma that obviously that's the dilemma of any election when we have to choose between.
I don't think that. Yeah. I don't think. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I don't think Clinton could have divided. I mean, certainly Clinton would have been a divisive president. I don't think that she could have divided the country the way that this presidency is. I don't think that you could have had such a successful division of the country the way it is now. And I don't think you could so effectively, because here's the thing, people saw through Clinton and people knew she was a warmonger, and even most of the left base they supported Clinton with serious reservations at the very least because they knew just how bad she was and that she wasn't a true liberal or true progressive or any of that stuff. Mm-hmm. Yet now, Trump, even a lot of progressives had a belief that Trump was this anti-war president, was going to be an anti-war candidate. And now Clinton couldn't have done away with this stuff. And now Trump can push the Iran hardline and the Islam hardline in ways that Clinton never could have. And I don't think Clinton would be ratcheting up tensions with Iran the way she is now. Yeah, she would have ratcheted up tensions with Russia, and that's obviously terrible. But you've got one dichotomy where you'd have Clinton pointing the finger at Russia and trying to get everybody all angry at Russia. Now you've got the other hand where you've got Trump getting everybody riled up with Islam in general, and with Iran in particular, Islam in general. And I don't think Clinton could have effectively done this.
No. But
so my gut tells me that Clinton very well may have been the designated loser of this election. Yeah. May have been the person up to lose.
Yeah, I mean, if you asked me in the Trump election in the summer before, I thought Trump was there to set up Clinton's victory. But then, I mean, again, we have to understand what's going on. We have to get a glimpse into the machinations of the oligarchs who are picking.
You could be wrong about this too, but I mean, I think at the very least, it's just as It's just as credible. It has just as much credibility as any other theory out there.
Yeah, and also remember, even then, maybe it was. Some people speculated it was these are two different factions. And then, so one faction went out, then, of course, the other factions, they're going to improvise and change. And they're going to apply pressure and strategize and come up with different approaches after the election result. After the votes are in, and, now we got to deal with the Trump presidency. Now, we can do that. We got the people to do that, too. So they'll deal with it then. Because at the end of the day, the president has very little power. I mean, he's...
I think if nothing else, that Donald Trump, I think he's very clearly what motivates him is ego. Very clearly. Mm-hmm. I think, he's got the ego of a child when it comes to a lot of things. Like, he very much bases his reaction to things based on how he perceives people think of him. Like, if he feels someone has slighted him, he'll just go on Twitter and lash out at them, right?
Yeah.
I think somebody like that is very, remember Netanyahu said the U.S. can easily be moved? I think that's how Trump is. I think people believe, I think the people in positions of power see that this is a man who can very easily be manipulated. And I think if there's any threat that Trump actually poses to the order of things, I'll tell you what I think it is. I don't think it's that he genuinely is a good-hearted man who has any type of real principles or anything for the good of humanity. I think it's that he could potentially be seen as a loose cannon type who, if he perceives that somebody has slighted him in any way, he could turn against them. That's what I think the threat that Trump might pose would be more of that. And that could be possibly maybe he has in common with someone like Richard Nixon possibly. I think that's where Trump potentially poses a threat, and that he could be a wild card in some areas, but I don't think it's out of a concern for the good of humanity. I think it's more or less that he has an ego that could just cause him to just lash out at people or turn on people who he thinks have hurt him in any way. That's where I think where I think the threat that Trump poses actually originates from.
Will there be a second term?
That's a really good question. I can't even begin to predict that, because who knows what the world's going to look like in 2018, much less in 2020.
Yeah, I know. Yes.
Remember, they've always got that wild card in there. If for whatever reason Trump were to slip on a banana peel or make the wrong person angry or something, or end up getting forced out of office via the political system or whatever, they've got Mike Pence waiting in the wings, and Mike Pence could run the ship much more effectively than Donald Trump, I think.
Yeah. So.
That man's a nightmare. If you think Trump's bad, just wait for Mike Pence. But I mean, look, Trump himself, I think his worst impulses make him a terrible, terrible, terrible representative. But I mean, Pence, though, minus the emotion, the instability of Trump, I think would be, people should be careful of what they wish for. Those who want Trump out should be very careful what they wish for, because I think Mike Pence could be much worse.
Yeah. So, oh well, anything else? Think we covered
I think we've pretty much covered it. And I did want to say one more thing about the whole, real quick, because I know we're getting late here, but I want to say one more thing about the whole Israel, Trump, Clinton thing, is that it appears to me, in addition to this pro-Trump media complex being a creation of the right wing in Israel, I also think that the campaign to expose the Clinton family is also originates from the same circles. And I'll lay this out because it's not to say I believe that just about all the information that's out there about the Clintons is absolutely true. I mean, what the Clintons did in Arkansas and Bill Clinton's history with women and their corruption and the Clinton Foundation, I believe all of that. But I think that the reaction to it and the exposing of it is coming out of a network that I think is the Netanyahu here in the West. They're closely affiliated with Netanyahu and the Likud in Israel, which see the Clintons as a threat to their agenda. It sees I think the left in America as a threat to their agenda, the establishment left, and therefore I think that the same network that is behind elevating someone like Trump to the presidency, I think, is also behind this campaign to expose the Clintons. They're very much stage managing and controlling this effort to expose the Clintons. I think that's where a lot of this media coverage and a lot of the negative publicity about the Clintons, I think you could even possibly, I could even speculate you could even possibly tie someone like Julian Assange into that whole network.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the creation of what you're seeing with the backlash against Clinton and the political establishment in general, even the establishment neocons, which have been very supportive of Israel, but are siding with the DC consensus, I guess you could say, over the Tel Aviv consensus. I think that this takedown of the establishment as we know it, with people like Steve Bannon leading the charge against the Republican establishment, I think that this is very much a campaign that was created in Israel, the right wing of Israel here in the West, and that was what brought down the Clinton campaign. Also, probably ultimately was behind the exposing of the Bushes. That Trump basically destroyed both the Bush and Clinton political dynasties, but I believe it was an orchestrated move, and I think all roads lead back to Tel Aviv. And people who want to talk about Jewish power opposing Trump, well, the biggest manifestation of all of Jewish power most likely got Trump elected and most likely was responsible for bringing down his political enemies.
Mm-hmm. And with his connections to people like Zucker and the media itself, which is so dominated, right, by...
Yeah.
I mean, is there a
you know how absurd that is? Oh, my God.
So, and I guess and these sort of these media moguls, these billionaires, of course, would see themselves as... having some sort of, obligation to Tel Aviv as opposed to the United States, right?
Well, I think they play both. I think they certainly have their tentacles on both sides. And at the end of the day, both sides protect each other. They shield each other from the criticism that would do the most damage, too. I mean,
it is the Anglo-Zio Empire, yes.
And it was Leslie Moonves of CBS, great nephew of David Ben-Gurion, who said Trump might be bad for America, but he's good for CBS.
And so the head of CBS is the nephew of David Ben-Gurion?
Leslie Moonves, yes, he's the great nephew of David Ben-Gurion.
And so that, you think that might affect CBS's coverage of the
I've always thought CBS is... I've even thought, all the networks are obviously heavily Zionist in their coverage, but I've always had CBS has laid on the Zionist propaganda a little thicker than the other networks.
Well, wasn't William Perley? Wasn't he Jewish?
Perley was the founder of CBS.
And he came out of OSS. And David Sarnoff, ABC. Well, there you go.
But here's the thing. Not a peep from the alt-right about Leslie Moonves saying that Trump's good for CBS, but when some executive in the front office at CBS made a comment about not feeling bad for Republicans getting killed at a country music concert in Las Vegas, they're all over that. They're all over using the 3 parentheses for that, but yet not a peep about Leslie Moonves, the great nephew of David Ben-Gurion, saying Trump's good for his network.
Mm-hmm. And it was David Ben-Gurion's, I guess, conflict with JFK in the early 60s, right? Didn't he resign over over the nuclear issue and also the American Zionist counter? Or
several months later, Kennedy hits a bullet.
Yeah,
gets bullets in him in Dallas.
Yeah, and of course people like Michael Collins Piper detailed the connection there with I think it was Permadex.
Roy Cohn was on the board of Permadex.
Roy Cohn was on really? Okay, that's interesting because I know that connects Clay Shaw. And to what was the Swiss bank out there that owned it?
The name escapes me at the moment. I don't know if Cohn was on the board, but he was closely affiliated with Permandex.
Yeah.
So,
but again, that's with the Kennedy thing. That's almost like there was like a consortium of volunteers.
And he definitely made a lot of the wrong people angry.
Yeah, he ruffled a lot of feathers. So.
I will give you a link to an interview if you've ever seen John McCloy talking to Walter Cronkite about the Kennedy assassination.
No, he sent that link to me. Yeah,
that video is on YouTube. It's I guess John McCloy was the first member of the Warren Commission to do a public interview. And I'm sure you're familiar with John McCloy's background.
Yeah. He was he was befriended by David Rockefeller or something, I think.
Yeah, he was. Yeah. CFR, Ford Foundation, all at the same time. Chase Manhattan Bank, all at the same time.
High Commissioner of Germany or something.
Yeah, he goes on with Walter Cronkite, and he talks about, well, I believed that I had questions about what happened to Kennedy until my good friend Alan Dulles took me up to the school book depository, and I realized that, well, it must have been Oswald that did it. And then he goes into how people who believe in the conspiracies just have a belief that they want to believe in this stuff and that they want to question things and believe that they, it's like the whole, they want to believe that they have the answers and stuff. And this yeah.
He doesn't address any of the problems with the official. No, he psychoanalyzes those people who.
Exactly, yeah. And his good friend Alan Dulles, that's the funny part. His good buddy took him to the school book depository. And there's a clip of George Bush on at Gerald Ford's funeral where he says that Gerald Ford always served his country, including the Warren Commission, which concluded that a lone gunman shot President Kennedy. And Bush kind of snickers when he says lone gunman.
Well, yeah, he's the one that moved the bullet hole. Like the shirt to make it.
Bush says, I had no idea where I was when he was assassinated. Yet Dallas Morning News, the day before, posted that he was going to be speaking to an group of oil men in Dallas, but he had no idea where he was. He was never in the CIA prior to 1976.
Yeah, that's right. They brought in. He was a virgin. Tells us virgin is the same at the time.
Yeah, sure.
So.
Just YouTube John McCloy, Walter Cronkite. You can find that interview. I think it's very telling of how propaganda works. It might be one of the best examples. He was actually given the Medal of Freedom by President Johnson within 2 weeks of the assassination. Him and Alan Dulles both.
Oh wow, it must have been a very proud moment for him.
Face.
I mean, the Medal of the people who've gotten it's like the Medal of Freedom is kind of like the Nobel Peace Prize, right? It's they give it to anybody.
It was created by a man who came up with the dynamite. Yeah.
Yeah, the Nobel family, which connected to big oil, actually, right? Yeah.
So
the oil field. So, but yeah, it's almost like people start to psychoanalyze that people have to believe in conspiracy because they want to believe that there's this paranoid mindset. No one ever psychoanalyzes those people who are gullible who want to believe the official narrative because it reinforces their comfortable view of the world.
Yeah, they act like conspiracy theorists are in it for fun. I tell you, this is the last thing from fun, understanding the real history of what, and what your government and what people who your leaders are really up to. This is the last thing from fun. I mean, but they just want to have fun and just have ridiculous theories. They're just, no, it's not fun.
No, actually, it's
the profit from it, but we're not having fun exposing the stuff. I mean,
it's the key to corporate success and being the popular guy in any barbecue. Right.
Yeah. That's the draw. That's the negative of people like Alex Jones getting so much media coverage is that people like us were automatically considered to be just like Alex Jones.
I can't every time I have someone say you're like Alex Jones. You have no idea.
Or if you criticize Jewish people, you just say, "Oh, well, you're just like that David Duke guy."
Yeah. Or you're Hitler. You're Hitler.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, but you're just like Alex Jones. Like, you're going to hear that all the time.
Well, ultimately, this is why people like David Duke and Hitler are promoted.
By design, by the way, Alex Jones at his trial with his wife, his custody trial, he basically came out and said that he's an actor.
Oh, that's I saw. he can't use he can't use the performances of his show against him. Mm-hmm. I guess there was some sort of thing with custody or character issue.
Yeah.
And his lawyer said that he's acting.
But thankfully, David Horowitz has shown Alex Jones the light, and that the real conspiracy is that the left and Islam are conspiring to destroy us.
Yes, because Barack Obama was a secret Muslim.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yep.
Oh. Okay, well, I'll let you go. I want to thank you for coming on the show. That is Greg McCarron. He is the co-host of the Antedote podcast. What's the best place to find that if people listen to that?
You go into YouTube and you type the Antedote. You can find our network. I'm working on getting our SoundCloud page back up and running. We might set up a Patreon page here at some point. But the easiest way to find us, you just go into YouTube and type in Antedote, Antedote. It'll link you to our channel and to our programs that we've done.
Okay, great. I'll let you go. Thank you. And maybe we'll talk again in the near future.
Yeah, I'd love to do this again.
Great. Good night then.
Thank you.